Good evening, everyone. This is yes,
Mixed bag.
Somewhat informal work session and opportunity to hear considerably more information from the staff about where we are in our bond planning efforts. Dan, are you the lead-off batter here?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay. Are we ready?
Yeah, we're
All
Sitting
right.
here already?
So everyone should have packets of information. And there's a PowerPoint presentation that I believe everyone has copies as well. I'm going to go through this pretty quick. I know there's a lot of material, so I think I'm going to try and get through some of the further information first, and then we can get into the discussion. Happy to go back and answer questions as well. And first, we're going to start with some context that the committee and other staff and board members have seen some of this before, so I'll go through that particularly quick. We'll jump in right away.
Amy, so do we, I know we've got both the bond planning and the enrollment balancing. Do we have a time we want to leave for the enrollment balancing conversation? Oh, is there?
No. Do you have the agenda here?
There was time on the other agenda that we had.
So, 2 hours for the bond conversation and 1 hour for the enrollment balancing.
2 on 1?
Yeah,
Oh, we said it's 8:30.
for the bond thing, and then from 8:30 to 9:30 for the enrollment balancing.
Why don't we do enrollment balancing first and send those people home?
I'm looking here for both. I'm hoping that's I see you.
Fine.
Is there any reason not to flip that? There's been a request. We can start with bond. We'll start with bond as presented. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Trying along. So in your packets, this is an old construction timeline for Portland Public Schools. It's just kind of a fun graph that shows when schools are built. It shows school enrollment over time. I realize you can't really read it here, but you have copies in your packet. It's kind of a fun little graphic. And what's really the point of this is almost all of our buildings were built before the moon landing, half of them before television was invented. So the point is the buildings are old. This is a graph that talks about capital planning that's happened in the district really over the last couple of decades. And there has been a lot of work that has been done in the last 15 or so years. There's been a number of different facility assessments that have been completed. The district has passed multiple bonds and has done some pretty significant long-range planning. A significant, really seminal document for the district's capital planning is our long-range facilities plan. The district has an adopted long-range facilities plan that was adopted in 2012. This is the primary document we go to when we're talking about capital planning. So it is active, it is on our website, and it is kind of the first place we go to when we talk about bonds or other large capital improvement work. The long-range facilities plan has a number of components to it. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Anyone can go on the website if they want to get into the details, but some of the key items are it has planning goals, facility goals. Those are pretty high level. They've got guiding principles that are also pretty high level, but contain important things like demonstrate fiscal responsibility. That seems pretty smart. Has recommendations in there that start to get a little more granular. It has non-capital recommendations, talking about looking at non-capital to enrollment, and also has capital recommendations that are much more specific to bond planning, including spending the bulk of bond funds on modernization work, allocating some to fix the worst facility needs, and so forth. It's also the first place that the district codified this multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar capital improvement program. The idea of going out for bonds and regular succession to support this long-term, very large capital need of the district. This is what we refer to as the subway tile plan, as people refer to it, and essentially what it shows is the idea of going out every 4 years for general obligation bonds and sustaining that for decades to address the capital needs of the district. So this is the document that's actually from the 2012 long-range facilities plan. So the numbers in here are not accurate, kept up to date, but the concept of this long-term plan is still the same.
Excuse me,
Yes, sorry.
which numbers are you talking about? Are you talking about the cost per thousand, or I missed that?
Both, actually. So the cost per thousand is not accurate currently.
Okay.
And then the numbers in the bonds as well. So it was accurate at the time in 2012, but.
The total figure and the cost per thousand are both off.
That is correct.
It's a placeholder.
Correct, you're right.
Thank you.
But another thing on here is this concept of focusing on high schools before the other work for the modernizations. So the long-range facilities plan specifically calls out looking at high schools and 3 high schools in the first one. Scott.
A little nuance in that. That was actually one of 4 options in the long-range facilities plan for attacking rebuilding. And when it came to the actual 2012 bond process, that was pushed by the Lucky Lab Group, which had a lot of alumni of the planning committee, but the district staff and board at that time were not focused on high schools. That was something that we brought to them in testimony, and they saw the wisdom.
Yeah, thanks for that background, and ultimately it is codified in the long-range facilities plan that we have right now. But also a good segue, the 2012 bond. So the 2012 bond follows the recommendations of the long-range facilities plan for allocating the majority of the funds to modernization projects, prioritizing high schools, and then excuse me, using some of the funds for other high-priority improvements. The 2012 bond also shows 3 criteria for how to prioritize the high schools, and that was seismic performance rating, accessibility to programs, so ADA needs, and high enrollment. And that equated to Grant, Franklin, and Roosevelt being in the 2012 bond referral. The bond passed with 66% approval. So effectively, going back to this long-term plan, the first one is down. Now, time to start planning the second one, which was targeted for 2016. So moving on to bond planning for the 2017 bond. 2017 also followed the long-range facilities plan of prioritizing high schools, allocating the majority of the funds to modernization projects, and using some funds for other high-priority improvements. This was also a specific recommendation that came out of the 2016-17 Bond Development Committee that met with the specific goal of to evaluate and affirm priorities and provide recommendations for the upcoming bond. And they actually made recommendations for both the 2016, which ended in 17, and 2020 bond. And they prioritized 3 different criteria for the high schools. That was facility condition assessment, historically underserved student enrollment, and high enrollment and overcrowding. It specifically made recommendations that to be Benson, Lincoln, and Madison based upon those specific variables.
So Dan, can you just pause for a second? I want to highlight it. So they stuck with the idea of high schools, but 2012, the criteria were seismic accessibility programs and enrollment. And in 2017, it was still enrollment. And then facility condition, improvement facilities for eyes and underserved students.
Correct.
And there was, at the time, debate about the remaining 6 high schools, which included this criteria.
Correct.
So Dan, there was actually an additional committee in 2014.
Superintendent's Bond Advisory Committee.
Yeah, and that committee looked at, made the initial recommendation for Lincoln, Madison, and Benson. And I don't, I can't remember the criteria they used, but the historically underserved was an added criteria that hadn't been applied in 2012.
And partnership potential was a criteria that fell off.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, I can't remember the exact criteria, but these 3 came in. Jefferson, at that point, we didn't have the initial results in from the new program partnership with PCC, and so it was like, yeah, the building needs it, but until we know how successful that program is, it's premature to talk about rebuilding.
Yeah, good concept.
Just,
The 2017 bond, of course, passed with also 66% approval, coincidence, including $150 million of the health and safety improvements as well. So 2 bonds passed, and now it is time to begin planning for the 3rd bond. Again, part of this plan that's going out on a regular basis for capital improvement bonds. And so we're targeting, of course, November of 2020 for this bond. And again, those numbers, public numbers, they're from the original plan. So the TBD for what the bond amount will be and what will contain. So we kicked off the School Improvement Bond Committee in October of last year. We want to get into that detail a little bit. But before that, we're going to take a little bird walk and talk about some of the structures of the bonds and how they're typically put together. But the materials that you have in front of you and which you'll regularly see is the work broken out into 4 different categories: educational improvements, physical facility improvements, capacity improvements, and modernization projects. All 4 of these categories are critical work. So I don't really think there's a right or wrong for which one is prioritized more than another. They're all important. The education improvements reflect the core mission of educating students. Physical facility improvements addresses the need of the safe, warm, and dry buildings. Capacity responds to the need to house our existing and future enrollment. And then the modernization work is the ability to address all 3 of those at one time. So they're all important categories of work. And the long-range facilities plan and the previous bonds have prioritized the modernization work, but that isn't necessarily what the district or this board wants to do going forward.
I'm just looking at those words, safe, warm, and dry, and I know that one of the complaints we've received from staff sometimes is that the buildings are too hot. So I'm wondering, like, I understand what safe, warm, and dry is referring to, but how are we also looking at those spaces? Like my daughter's 8th grade math class, it was like in the sun on that side of the building by May. I don't know that a lot of learning was happening in the afternoons. So how does that fit into, like, I mean, is warm code for like all environmental
Yeah,
systems?
that's a great, yes, it
Safe
is. It's really our,
temperature regulated and dry.
Yeah, it's not quite as snappy now.
yeah, it's really our mechanical system.
Yeah, I mean, safe hot and dry is problematic.
Yeah.
Safe cold and dry is problematic. So.
Right, yeah, it's really our mechanical systems.
Yeah.
Mechanics.
They can not work in both directions. Well,
I was assuming that, but I just wanted to clarify.
yeah, no, it's very good clarification. So back to the School Improvement Bond Committee. So we started meeting in October, and some of the topics that we have discussed to date are this high-level criteria, as we called it, that we've just gone over about the long-range facilities plans, previous bond criteria recommendations. We've also gone over initial staff priorities for within the scopes of work for educational and physical and capacity improvements, what those look like, what those initial prioritizations of work look like. The committee got presentations on the conceptual master plans for the 3 high schools. And just last week, we went over high-level the facility condition assessment that has been completed. And we've gone through those things in that order, somewhat intentionally, at least I hope that's what we're headed towards, is an informed decision. So we brought forward information about plans that exist in previous bonds and how those have been put together, what the total need is of the district. We're bringing forward cost data both from the FCA and from the high school planning as well. And then staff recommendations and community input are still things that will be brought forward to the board and to the committee to help make this informed decision about the bond. So hopefully those are the main pieces of the ingredients that will help inform the ultimate decision.
So Dan, how, just to go back to the other side, how do you see the racial equity and social justice lens informing that decision? I found through here, there's some references to it sometimes, like the replacement of the criteria, but I'm wondering how that will, is that an additional set of information that's going into the informed decision, or is it like where the arrows are, or?
I think we'll get to that a little bit when we get into the discussion about the criteria and what this board or this group might want that criteria to be. So I think we'll get there, but if we don't,
I had a similar question about, I mean, it was more of a comment or an observation, like, this is an operational piece that would be an ideal time to, operationalize our racial equity, plan in the criteria stage.
So I think we'll get there a little bit, but if we don't
We'll
address
let
it
you
well
know if
enough,
you don't.
yeah, please, let's come back to that. So we want to start moving towards the handouts and the discussion. A couple more pieces before we go there. So this is just a recap of some of the high-level criteria and the modernization criteria that have been used to date. And you will see those reflected in the scenario stuff that's in the handouts that you'll see in a minute. And also the initial priorities on the educational improvements and the physical facility improvements that we've discussed about with the committee. You will see those reflected in the scenarios as well. So we want to move to some of the handout information, and we're going to focus on 3 documents, at least at first. One that is called Facilities Deficiencies. Actually, there's 2 of them have a name, so I apologize. And then the sample scenarios. One quick sidebar before we go there. There's going to be a lot of cost data that is in these documents. So I want to give a little information on how we are putting together these cost estimates. Our cost estimating methodology for really all of the work is breaking out the different cost variables and then estimating those and reviewing those on an individual basis.
Can you make that, I'm sorry, can you make that larger?
Let me try that.
It's in here.
I don't know
Page
if I can.
31, it's page 31. So it also, yeah, control plus.
Oh, look at that.
We've got it here.
Well, I'll read them off real quick what the variables are. So the hard cost is where the primary, the bulk of the costs are going to be. So we're going to get those from a specific data source. It's likely going to be the facility condition assessment, which will give us hard cost data. Or for the high schools, for example, our professional cost estimators are going to give us that hard cost data. The other costs are what we'll call markups. So those, the FCA, for example, does not include soft costs, design costs, permitting costs, these other costs that will go on top of hard costs. Fixtures, furniture, and equipment, contingencies, escalation. Those are all things that get estimated separately, and this is the exact data that we are going over with the Bond Accountability Committee. So we are breaking out to this level of detail. We're showing them all of the data that goes into it, and then we're reviewing with them all of the assumptions that go into the markup. So what is the right escalation percentage, for example? We're going to bring data forward to the BAC, and then we're going to come to a recommendation of what that is. So that's just a little context of how that's happening. I don't need to go into too much detail today. But also wanted to bring back the cone of uncertainty, which is a real thing. You can look it up. We mentioned it before. And
Don't we all live in it all the time?
You will see things that look like this. The point being, as time goes on, you become more accurate. We are looking at scopes of work and projects that some are many, many years out. So the data on them is pretty high level. The costs and the numbers you see can and will change. So that's the cone of uncertainty. So back to the handouts. We have 2 that say facility deficiencies at the top. One of them has 2 columns of cost data and then a whole bunch of notes to the right of that. So if people want to look at that, I'm going to walk through that briefly. Again, you will see those categories of work that we have talked about before, that we put up on the slides before, with the modernizations, the educational improvements, the physical facility, and the capacity. And then you will see these ranges of costs. And so depending on the category, the ranges are a little bit different. So for example, on our modernizations, the ranges that you see there, for our high schools, we have different options, and then we still have ranges of costs that are in those options. So that's just showing the low and the high of those different high school options. The educational improvements, you will see not necessarily a low, but where you see the high end is what the current estimate is for that scope of work. And we do have subject matter experts here tonight to answer some specific questions if you have about those categories. And also there is some backup data about the technology, about the curriculum, about some other scopes of work that are in here. So if you had a chance to take a look at that and have questions, please let us know.
Dan, can you clarify, when you list an amount under the low part of the range, is it fair to say that that's informed by must do? Because either we know an HVAC system is about to fail, has failed or is failing, or we know will be failing. But when you see a number in the low range, these are sort of sky get done.
Great question, and thank you for that. Segue, so on the physical facility, the low is data that's come from our facility condition assessment, and the amounts for low are systems either currently failing or anticipated to fail in the next 2 years. The high are systems that are anticipated to fail within the next 10 years. And that's what that footnote is there at the bottom. So there's a lot of those that are similar to
So
that.
low and high are really,
They're not measuring the same thing.
when I see low and high, I think to do X, it might cost between here and here.
It's a floor, it's not a range.
Well, no, it's not even a floor. This is work that needs to be done like now versus we can wait a little longer.
Well, the next
But
column
and
is
then
the life of the bond program.
Yeah, but also the 10-year doesn't mean that's looking at all the, pick one of those lines. The total need across the district might exceed that 10-year.
It's,
Yes, there are costs that will exceed. So if a system isn't anticipated to fail within 10 years, it's not on here. We just decided to pick where's a good line to draw, and we could have drawn a different line.
is, maybe I'm not seeing it, but when there's, I know we're not talking about a range, but when there's a large spread between those numbers, is that something to be concerned with?
Do you have an example? That's fine.
Yeah, I'm looking for one. Under physical facility improvements, I think it's the asbestos. Can't quite read it, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's 0 to 72 million.
Okay, asbestos, it's the ADA improvements, American with Disabilities Act, goes from 10,300,000 to 10 times that, 107. I'm curious about that spread.
Sure, great question. So
Whereas some of these are quite closer, within, I don't know, a couple million.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for example, so they're not all the same ranges, and that's why I admit that it's a little bit confusing. We're trying to not just pick one number and give some options, or to show a high and low, if you will. The ADA, for example, so I'm sorry, I'll go back. Where you see the double asterisk, that's referencing the same footnote, but saying that is coming effectively straight from the facility condition assessment. So that's that 0 to 2 year, and then the 0 to 10 year. Many of the other scopes aren't coming directly from the facility condition assessment, so we're showing a different range.
Okay, so with new construction, there would be no additional ADA costs because it would be done in the design phase, right?
Correct.
But so that's zero cost, or those costs are rolled into the original construction, right? There's no extra cost for ADA work.
Full
Correct. If you're doing a
modernization gets you the
modernization,
whole
yes, it'll be-
enchilada, all the
it'll be
health and
included.
safety, all the.
But then those other costs are for going back and retrofitting existing buildings?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have, most of our middle schools don't have an elevator, or there's a large number that don't.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure.
Ramps.
The number of steps.
Ramps, hallways, bathrooms.
So what you're suggesting is we need
Teacher
a
lunches.
10-year, $5 billion bond.
I'm definitely pointing out that the needs are very, very high, and the needs are big. And no matter how we slice this bond, it will not address all the needs.
I'm curious why there isn't an option on the A, B, and C scenarios for 2 high schools and 1 reduced. But it's the 3 scenarios we have are 3 high schools, 2 high schools, or 1 high school and 1 reduced.
Let's jump there.
Okay.
So, so there's another document that also says facility division 2, sorry about that. But instead of 2 columns of data, it has 5 columns of data. So the first 2 are the same ranges, and then the other 3 are sample scenarios. So where we talked about before, the criteria, the long-range facilities plan and previous bonds, and the initial priorities by staff, we're trying to reflect what those might look like here. And to your point, I think that's a viable option as well.
I just want another column of data.
We can make that happen, I promise. There is an infinite number of columns. But these scenarios, and there is a document in your packets that called sample scenario overview, so it gives a little detail about the 3 different scenarios. But the big change in between them is scenario 1 is a sample of what it might look like if a bond included funds to complete the 2017 bond projects, the multiple pathways building, which is a part of 2017, and then 3 high schools, just at an average price, not going into specifics about the individual schools. Option 2 would be 2 schools potentially, and option 3 would be 1 school at a full scope and 1 school at a reduced scope. And so what you're able to see with those different, kind of the bigger pieces of the puzzle fit in, how do these other categories of work get prioritized, get allocated funds?
So when you say reduced scope, can you give a little more detail on what that means? Would it be up to seismic level 3, for example?
Reduced scope isn't defined here, so it would have to be something that we would look into.
But it was defined
Less
for
than
the
the full
estimating exercise, or is this just a very ballpark estimate?
This is just a generic number.
So it
just
wasn't
to have the
reduced, the
conversation.
estimators weren't provided with what the reduced scope might be,
Correct.
and then.
Correct, and we didn't here want to put in specific per
Right.
school. This is more just a generic numbers of school versus school specifics.
Mainly to model that there are different scenarios.
Absolutely, yeah.
To conceptualize here.
Is that also, would that fit to say sequenced versus, like reduced sounds like a permanent term versus sequenced, which,
That could be true as well, yeah. So it could be a phased approach.
well, I think that, just from a community standpoint, maybe, well, actually maybe more thoughtful and informed, to do things sequenced sometimes, but reduced sounds like a permanent, like less than.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's a good point.
So I'm wondering from a staff standpoint, and because we haven't seen all the data on the facilities conditions assessment, we have seen some of the suitability and sort of, you've got this category in schools in the poor, and figure out what the other low category is. Poor and unsuitable, is that the other one?
I think that's right.
Okay.
What's that word?
It's poor, and then it was that colored graph chart that had like a very small number of schools that were green, that were excellent. It was all the suitability index. Pardon?
Is that not in our package?
see it again. Pardon?
That was at the bond committee meeting last Thursday.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
got it.
Okay, thank you.
But what I was gonna ask is, did you look at those schools that you did a sort of cross matrix of both that were the lowest of the suitability and then the lowest of the facilities conditions index, that you might end up with a Fabian or Kellogg, something that this is going to fail, or like we shouldn't have students in a school, or a school like Tubman where like we know that there's no environmental conditions. Did you guys look at that? Is that a category that we ended up with last time that was not high school?
We haven't looked, I don't think, specifically at that component. What staff did look at was the different categories of work that went into the suitability, into the FCA, and look to prioritize what those scopes of work would be. So on the physical facility side, roofing systems, mechanical systems, security upgrades, and seismic consistently were the priorities from staff, from the physical facility standpoint. So that is likely where we would recommend spending the majority of the funds on those scopes of work.
So just to follow on, because I think this could answer my question. Say you had a bunch of schools in the poor and unsuitable category, but you did a combination of roofs, X, Y, and Z. Would they move, is it possible to move them up to like, hey, we got everybody up to fair, and we were still able to do all the other work that we want to do as well? this is like the worst of the worst, but I'm just wondering where the worst of the worst.
Where that
line
floor
is.
is.
So we tiered the suitability scores.
Like, yeah, could you get rid of all the, could you move all the schools out of unsuitable? Because I don't think anybody wants to have unsuitable.
So Julie, can I ask a clarifying question? Because we've got SEA, which is the physical condition, and then the suitability, educational suitability. Are you talking about both?
Well,
Either, because they're
totally different, right? That's what I'm saying, it's some sort of matrix score, and we have the suitability scores by this schools, which tells you one thing. It's, well, it actually Dan sent this afternoon.
So back in the day, if you got a new roof, your FCA would move up like by 30 points kind of thing. And I don't know if it's the same now, but that was a big deal and really changed the ranking.
Right, so I'm wondering is there something like that we say, we don't have any schools unsuitable, and frankly, we don't have any poor schools either, and I don't know how much that costs or what exactly that entails, but I'm just, this is again where you draw the line, and if it requires, but I just want to understand that.
Right, and I think maybe a partial answer to that is, so the unsuitable scores are coming from the educational facility, not the physical facility side. So that would be, you might fall into, John, feel free to chime in if you want. You're unsuitable because your school is small and you don't have a music room, you don't have an art space, you don't have a secondary gym. So that would be unsuitable. So to get you up there, we could build those additions. And that could take you out of unsuitable into whatever category that is. So it's feasible, we could look at something like that, but I think ultimately you're going to see a lot of scope that isn't roofs and mechanical and seismic and technology.
Would those be taken care of then if you were doing the matrix with the facilities condition index of here are the things that get you safe, warm, and dry? I know is which was the 2012 slogan. It would be the roof, which would be the dry. I'm just wondering, so that's, you're saying for the suitability, maybe those would be things you want to add, but if you had on the facilities condition index, like a similar poor or unsuitable, but if we did the roof, that would.
So Julie, what you're saying is, do we have, I mean, okay, we've got suitability index, we've also got facility condition index. You're saying, if you just take the worst of facility condition index, what would it cost to get those schools out of the worst into something less than the worst?
Yeah, I guess like, do we have a basic that we'd like, yeah, we'd send our kids there because it has the basics. Not great, still needs to be modernized, but it's safe, warm, and dry.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too, like my question about that though is if we invest in this bond cycle in getting things up from unsuitable or poor, and then we do a whole rebuild, like is that smart economics to invest this time around knowing that we're going to do a ton of work on this 30-year plan? Like where, and so I think there are some things we can do in the interim to like make schools as close to safe, warm, and dry as we can, but I think we have to balance that with that long-term view of investing in a place that we're just going to tear down in 5 years.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's just not knowing how much is it 800 million to get to safe, warm, and dry, or is it 150 million?
So maybe the question, because I mean, this is something that as the district continues to get more sophisticated in its asset condition, I think it's a good question of do we have that data yet? Ultimately, that's where we want to go, and we talked about that in the really early bond committee meeting. So we want to have an asset management report for the district that every year is updated that shows the entire backlog, the condition of everything, and what it would take, both what it would take in terms of annual maintenance to keep things from getting worse, and what it would take over a 10-year time horizon to invest. It takes a long time to get there, and I don't think we're there yet. But I think your question's a good one, just because it would, it would be useful to know ballpark. Could we get those schools out of failing condition or whatever it is for the facilities for?
It's another level of analysis that would be helpful.
So, and I also think in the community when we get out to the community stage, because this statement here that says these schools are already in failure or are going to fail by 2021, people might look at, well, I think Cleveland's still going to be there in 2022. I mean, you could argue.
It's going to be hot.
But they're going to compare compare it to maybe their school conditions, so being able to speak to what our standard is and sort of where we do through the line of this is the right amount to do and this we should save for the full modernization.
And I mean, I think Cleveland's a perfect example of like the environmental systems already in critical failure. How much do we invest in them knowing that we will probably be replacing that high school in the next few years? So what's the best economic use? And as a parent of a student there, I can tell you what her opinions are about what we should do, but we have a larger responsibility.
I didn't want to pick on Wilson.
Yeah. It's totally fine to pick on
Wilson is hot, apparently.
But I think it could lead to a conversation about, okay, parsing out the different categories on the facilities condition assessment. What really interferes with learning and teaching?
And I think what we're getting back to is the criteria conversation, is there is no right answer in terms of how much to invest in those schools. It's just a question of yeah, I mean, we could invest more, 100 million, 200 million, 500 million, and make more progress the more we spend. But then there's a zero cost to that, you know, for other things that we're not doing, right? So I think that's a great segue maybe into the criteria, sort of this conversation.
And so my head is still in as much as we can into modernization and the minimal to keep what we've got going into the other schools. And it's in part from looking at this historically, and I don't think it's changed that much, is to say we've got a lot of buildings that are in just absolute crappy shape. They're not this much from being fair. They're significant. And the more we put into the Band-Aid stuff, the less we get to that point where all of our schools are seismically safe. And that to me is like, that's hanging out there. And that puts, I mean, it's a really uncomfortable place to be, but that's where we are. If we were having this conversation 50 years ago, we'd be able to do that kind of, yeah, let's get our modernization program going at a steady pace, but still have a lot to put into the maintenance end of things. And our deficit is so big, I still think we just have to go all in on modernization. And again, I'm persuadable to do otherwise, but that's where I'm coming from.
We're going to language check here. So my understanding is modernization equates to high schools. Am I wrong?
Not necessarily.
Is it any sort of
Historically, it
formula?
has. Yeah.
But we don't have any scenarios that call out full modernization for anything other than high schools.
So I think this is a good segue to go into criteria. The samples are reflecting what the precedence has been and what the discussions have been. So focusing on the high schools. Yeah.
Before we move on, though, I just wanted to go to Director Bailey's point that in the 3 scenarios we have listed here, there's no money for seismic in any of those 3 scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So that we would not be doing.
That's to do the seismic right.
So we'd have to do 1.2.
Cost effective, you just go in and redo the whole building.
Yeah, I want to be really clear, there's actually over $1 billion for seismic.
Yeah.
Because we're up
Right.
high schools.
Well, I'm just looking at this
Right.
low to cost,
Right.
but is that 1.2, that's different than the redoing the high schools, correct? That's on the scenario here?
That would be like safe exit
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
all.
So the seismic items in the earlier bond were not to get up to that. Everybody's gonna walk out safely standard. It was, you know, because there's a lot of different strengths of quakes that could hit, and it's not a bad idea to,
Do somewhere.
yeah, do some.
But I'm just trying to understand this 1.2 billion that we have under the initial facility deficiencies in column 2. There's 1.2 there, but there's nothing in any of the scenarios.
So I think Scott's point here is we could spend $1.2 billion, bring all of our schools, I assume that's for all of our schools, estimate, right, up to a seismic standard, I don't know exactly what standard it is, but better than they are today. But that wouldn't actually be fixing all the other things in the schools, so that if we later went back into the building, it would have been money.
It's the same thing that Julie and I were just saying about the
Wouldn't
economic
be making
cost.
any learning
Right.
improvement.
But I just want to make sure we're clear that all this money going into high school modernization or going into any other school modernization is seismic
Seismic money.
investment. It's also ADA
And
investment, it's also
accessibility,
technology
yep.
investment, it's also all.
Correct.
All right, we'll try to let you proceed.
Well, I think it's a good opportunity to segue into the discussion. So we have some questions for board members to discuss. And so I think we're thinking about maybe if you can pair up quickly, go over the questions, and then allow board members to report out what their opinions are. We want to. Kara, do you mind? Pass that along. So while it's going around, I'll just read out quickly what the questions are. The first one is that the 2012 and 17 bonds follow the recommendation of the long-range facilities plan of allocating the majority from modernization, prioritizing the high schools, etc. Should PPS continue to follow these recommendations? Number 2 notes that the previous bonds, the criteria that they used for prioritizing the different high schools, seismic performance, ADA, enrollment, historically underserved students. So going for this bond, are those the appropriate criteria? If not, what the board members think might be the appropriate criteria? Number 3 notes that in previous committee meetings, we talked about the initial staff prioritization of the scope of work projects within the scope of work, which is reflected on the facilities scenario documents that you have here. Do those seem to be the right prioritizations? If not, is there something that should be higher? You think there's something that should be lower? Number 4, the 3 sample bond scenarios have been provided based upon current planning documents, previous bond criteria, initial scope of work prioritization, and discussions held to date. Do any of these scenarios seem more aligned with PPS priorities? Are there any specific changes that the board would like to see? And then number 5 is, at future meetings, staff will present the board or committee with information including the RES-J lens training, staff recommendation for a full bond package, vetted cost estimate process and data, and community input. Is there additional information that the board will need to help inform the decision about the bond?
So you want us to break into groups, or?
Are we gonna have how much time do we have for this?
Why don't we do 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Discussion?
10 minutes.
Oh, no. Start with 10.
We'll check in at 10.
Check it in. I'll come over.
15.
10 minutes.
10 p.m.
10 p.m.
We're going?
We're a team.
Okay.
You can join us.
Oh, we're
next
doing
time.
threes?
Rita, you can join us.
Okay, you can do threes.
We'll have one group of 3.
We're doing threes. Oh, okay. All right, it's not you and me.
Okay.
Hi.
The first thing, question 2. Maybe the bonds.
That's my stuff.
Are these appropriate?
That's what I mean, but I ran them, so I think I would oh, I guess
Just like the pie chart.
Or no, that's like the pie chart that was legally acceptable.
Right.
question number 1. Majority of and then do some of the other ones.
So I think we should, I think that's not a cost effective. So I've heard
What do you think we should do? No, high
We've seen a few student reps coming up.
Some of them were almost as good as we
Typically budget worst case scenario in about 17.
Thanks, so I needed that. Yeah, it's that fish. Yeah, we
I'm going to wait till I see.
Do you think that that should be there?
Okay.
It's like water or like.
Well, I hope so. We want to number 2, I actually want to look at except for the 2 physics, so science is just a subset of facility condition. So that changed from being a very specific facility condition to being a more general facility condition. And then number 3, high enrollment pathways. So that's actually the same. Versus sort of sort of making that
It's different from like water that we have that.
We always have.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, if we're gonna order these ones with creative, having like the, I don't know, the facility condition is vitally important, but I think we're gonna prioritize, get stuff first.
But I think you're just saying about this. We're going to have to
We're gonna have to rethink the mental
anything else that's a criteria like this?
So it's just the sequence kind of, they may not get it.
Packet or just like a lot of things, they're not real.
When I think when I never they're there, there's a message of like going out. Oh, they're just nice so they can learn that space. So the stairs are all like one away and everything's completely to learn. But there's a and to everybody. Yeah.
But I feel like when we're doing that, I don't really understand.
Yeah, freeze this time. Right. That's right.
Say that happens. We don't know if that's going to happen.
I explained that very well.
Is it what is it? It's kind of like yeah, it does.
Suitability and
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, representative.
I didn't explain that well. Maybe spend classrooms. Questions about the
Oh, yeah, we have a question.
Great question. What with my dad is intentional facility So previous bonds have majority of the funds in modernizations left into the
Is it just the latest vision? I mean, is it like, are there 10 other things? I'm just saying that the savior of this, we're going to is it all right? Or is it value there that's I guess here's my question. Again, I have no
So like what kind of items could possibly stay there for a while and how to
well, and the challenge is
help say in like a year, because you know we've been at training for years and there's
but that'll be a really hard decision. 50 teachers is there any risk that by technology like we're buying textbooks and materials now? Number 2
Did I almost just step on you? How can be helpful? Step on you? Oh, okay. No,
so let's see what's in here. Let's just talk about this.
oh, yeah, okay.
But I still, I guess
Go outside.
funny process. And that was just not been. Well, I've been in touch with Ted and it's good. I'm missing a lot, you know, those sort of things. That said, it always yeah, no, that's it. Well, we get too close, come back together, okay, I'll tell you this. I need more time. All right, we'll put more time. Oh yeah. No, that's the class I see. It's just life and safety. Well, life safety is what we are. You know, from National Guard guys who are plugged in, you know, because that's what a lot of it yeah, good. Can I leave the key for your house? I might need to get your canned goods and your water. I need water.
You gotta dig it.
Oh yeah, no, I started joking about it. Yeah, I'm stuck in my cigarettes. No, the Christ Church is not
We'll be sure to give it away.
We're further ahead.
Huh? We're just going to give it to her right now.
Did they use the exterior plates? Yeah, that's good. That's
Very high standard, but it's like.
I actually, it's, yeah, I think it's the kind of project I aspire to. A buddy of mine did his hand, you know, he's not anything. You gotta be able to get access.
Did you give it to Kara? It's not with my stuff.
Yeah. Sure. So you want to do what vintage is your house? Yeah, same. All right. Where are we going? My wife, she's not serious about what Actually, my wife and I have projects in Thailand, bring money. We have retirement those days, but they don't want you to be charged for it. Yeah, Lordy. No, my wife actually she's fluent in Spanish, which is helpful. So, that's lovely. They've been really successful. I think the whole system which so speaking of they chose to not come poor Peter. So yeah, Denver was my center. Are you doing it tonight? Okay, so
What do you guys have? Do you guys know these questions?
oh no, sorry. Oh yeah. Well, that was. When I heard and also, I have a couple they all it doesn't exist.
You want to go to report out? Dan? Yes. You want to facilitate? I think so. Yeah, thank you. We are going to get
I wonder why.
Yeah, I don't know that for sweets for
I think we can put that in there, even if it's not estimated there. We should something about play structure, we want to take all the issues, not just the structure, no matter what they do.
Because there was also
Yeah, that's aspect. That's big. No, that's strides.
Okay, take my advice, but
Okay, I think we are moving on to
One, I had a couple questions that I'd like to, just so everyone can hear. On the sample, every sample scenario at the bottom has a program contingency of 10%. And what that is, that creates this flexibility and is a risk management tool, because this is a long-term bond, so needs and opportunities will change over time. But the money that's in that 10%, which is not an insignificant amount of funds, will be spent on those other categories of work. So sometimes if you see zero somewhere, that doesn't necessarily mean zero, it just might be not a lot. Because there are other funds that will go into those categories of work on the scenarios. That's just one point of clarification.
I'm sorry, what did you say about that 10% coming from where?
On the scenarios at the bottom of them all, there is a program contingency of 10%. And so effectively over the life of the bond, those funds would be spent on those different categories of work as needs arise through the course of the bond. So why don't we move to report out, and I think what we're going to do is by group report out on answers to the 5 questions and any other information that came up. So Rita, would you and your group like to start? No?
Not quite ready?
I want to talk about Wilson, Jefferson, and Cleveland.
Okay.
So we hit question 4. The 3 sample bond scenarios have been provided, and then do any of the scenarios seem more aligned with PPS priorities than others? And we really got into talking about Jefferson, Wilson, and Cleveland, and this idea of like, it depends on what we're talking about with those scenarios and the alignment of values. And as we look at, the questions around Jefferson about enrollment, and if we build a 1750 high school there, what does that look like? As there's been, I know there's rumors because I've been getting public comment on the rumors about including Wilson in the bond, and so that question of it is the younger school, but there's this sort of promise we've made to the public to do the high schools, and so if we end up doing an 8-year bond, and I don't know if that's too in the weeds for this conversation, but I think it's hard to answer that question about alignment with values when we're talking about, we know the specific schools and we know some of the kind of things that are challenges with those schools, and so how do we make a statement on values when we're kind of wrestling with all those pieces?
But one of the values we did talk about with regard to the high schools was an original underlying value, which didn't show up in our little walk down memory lane, is prioritizing high schools because it affects all students. And because kids only get hit with the displacement once, most likely in their whole K-12 time.
So on question 2, we had suggested moving on the 2017 bond criteria, moving point 2, improving facilities for the highest number of historically underserved students, to number 1. And I know we don't really use those as numbered criteria, but we wanted to elevate our ESG understanding, and then facility condition, and then the high enrollment overcrowding. But we also wanted like a subset there that mentioned high school as that retained priority.
So if I could ask, on the item number 1, was there any discussion about that? Do I understand this group is?
We were all on board with
Yep.
continuing those recommendations.
We were good until we got to question 4.
Oh, okay. So, okay, I apologize.
Sorry, we buried the lead.
Yeah. We started with the concern.
So, okay, so yes is from the group on number
Yes.
1. Prioritizing
Yeah.
memorizations, high schools, okay.
Although I would say that my caveat is it's difficult having such high altitude estimates, because that some of the funds for other high priority improvements, what does that mean?
Yes.
How much is that? Will there really be anything in that category? Will there be enough to make a difference in some of these other? So that's what makes it challenging. But generally speaking, we're on board with those
Yes.
priorities.
Put another way, if doing the 3 high schools only left $20 million for those other things, that might sway us versus if it leaves $200 million for those other things, it feels more.
It might sway some of us.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I mean, I'm not saying it would, I'm saying that that's, Amy's point was that that does matter a little bit, when we
Yeah.
say some of the funds, what is that?
That's a bit ambiguous still.
Sure. Yep, that's.
Yeah, but we were,
Be
the 3 of us were good with
inconsequential.
number 1. Number 2, we were good with the 2017 criteria, which is putting that emphasis on underserved students and the equity piece of it. And then we didn't have much on 3. Curriculum, yeah, that's right. We did think the curriculum impact could be really, a really good district-wide investment that hits all kids.
And-
And then number 4, Haley is talked about.
Jumped right to it.
And also because elevating kind of the RESJ framework is just going to be a way of winnowing through the facilities condition index as assessment, because there's going to be more work than we're able to do. So it's just a way of prioritizing. You wouldn't end up with that priority leading you to invest in schools that weren't needy, because we have an abundance of schools that are.
We spent a long time talking about high schools, so we didn't really come up with any other information we wanted on number 5.
What's a good segue for us?
Because you're all about number 5?
Well, we had one more thing, which was, are there any other scopes the board would like to see higher or lower on the initial prioritization lists? And we talked about curriculum. And again, it's a sense of how much actually buys what. Luis hasn't formally made a pitch yet or educated us about what that looks like. I mean, we have a number here, but what does that buy us? So we wanted to elevate that.
Yeah. Maybe more broadly, things that impact students throughout the district in terms of their achievement.
Yeah.
Curriculum seems to fall in that category. There may be 1 or 2 other things that fall into that category we want to take into consideration. But that would be, for me, at least, that's what I think.
And if you really want us to do things like rank, where we feel things like special education classrooms or athletics fall, we can do that for you as well. But I think as a whole, as a district, we have a sense of like, you know, the learning environment is a priority.
And that kind of also gets to question 4, which is how does this align with our board priorities, our stated goals?
Our goals.
Okay, we talked about that. Not a bad one. I'm segueing to
Good
another
for
group.
you that you followed the
Move on.
directions.
We see
Yeah,
the
you guys
floor.
can
We see
follow the
floor.
directions. You can
We
start.
did not follow the directions as well as you did. We're going back to Harvard.
So I have to say, we were still talking, so I didn't hear everything, but, okay.
We missed it.
It was really great.
Are you on number 1? So, we are not in favor of maintaining the previous priorities intact. Some of them, yes, but not all.
So you asked me number 1?
Or are you down to 2?
No, well, we're reflecting on, you know, should we continue to follow these recommendations? The answer was not necessarily.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or, no.
In a modified way.
So, we had some questions, and I think so looking at the 2012 and 2017 priorities, we crossed out high enrollment and overcrowding, because there are better ways to deal with enrollment issues. So that just didn't really make sense. Okay, so high schools. The high schools are continuing, just, you know, trading down the track. We're just going to stick with the 3 high schools. It is, while it might be satisfying on some level, it's going to be very problematic for other things. So if my addition is correct, if we do the 3 high schools, plus we finish the promises we made on 2017, we're looking, I think, at $1.2 billion, right? Just for those. out of a potential $1.4 billion bond.
I think just one, just on the scenarios, right? Am I missing something?
Scenario
Well,
A.
that's the high
That's the
for
big.
the,
Right.
yeah.
Well,
For-
but this
for
doesn't,
the-
Roosevelt is not, finishing Roosevelt is not here.
It's down below.
Is Benson on here?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
balance.
The
The
first
first
line
first
item
line.
is effectively.
Oh, right, okay, got it, okay. Anyway, so we're uncomfortable, given the tremendous number of other needs that have emerged. We were uncomfortable devoting that much of the bond to high schools. Just because, you know, we can't do everything, so we're gonna have to make some tough choices, I think. We need to finish the 2017 bond. We need to do Roosevelt. We need to build out Roosevelt to 1,700. We also need to pay attention to middle school redesign, and we will almost certainly need a second middle school in Southeast, so we need to factor that in. We need to pay attention to the FCA, the Facilities Condition Assessment, and we need to continue a prioritization of health, safety, and ADA. To what level, we don't know. We also need to do, or we should do some, at least something on educational improvement. It's not often that we're going to have an opportunity to actually kind of fill the enormous curriculum hole that we have. So I think we need to pay attention to that. Did I miss anything?
But, okay.
I would add that and we didn't actually get to this, but I would add, I'm worried about technology. I'm worried about our infrastructure, because I think I think we have some risks. And so additional information we would like. We'd like to get an estimate on finishing out our Roosevelt, building out to 1,700. Some cost estimates on sort of seismic stuff.
To get to a
Like,
basic standard.
Could we get to some basic level of seismic upgrades that would maximize the number of kids, maximize the number of buildings that would be survivable?
But we also want to get, they've helpful to me to get like this level 1, 2, 3, what we're looking at seismically. Are we getting people out of the building? Are we building to shelter in place?
And just to add one thing to overarching, it wasn't so much not continuing at the high schools, but sequencing them out in the bond because of maybe new information. So when that plan happened in the early 2000s, that we have new information now, and that that should inform what we're doing. It's not that the high schools still aren't having this priority place as we go about the full modernizations. It's just there's other things that need to happen. And so, for example, like the curriculum materials, that's something new that we can do, and actually would probably touch every classroom and every student. And so, and it's one that, as long as I've been around 20-something years, we've never been in compliance with any of the curriculum adoptions. So a way to sort of layer that in as well.
And we're maintaining the assumption that we're going to continue with the bond program, into the future. So it would be postponing some of the
what?
high schools, not canceling.
Yeah. Can I ask some questions? So, I think we need to continue to come back to the context of already on this sheet we're showing $5 billion of need, which is not comprehensive and everything. the district has, right? And so, I mean, we need to keep repeating this publicly. 1.4 billion is only going to bite off. It's a very large chunk, but it's a small chunk of what needs to be done. So when we talk about whether we do high schools now or high schools later and move other things forward, it is really just a question of that overall prioritization, right? It's a question of do we, do we stay sort of with this path, or do we go down a different road? And I'm curious, when you talked about a couple of the things, like why in your view is building Roosevelt to 1700 a higher priority than some of the other things that have been on the table? I thought in our enrollment balancing conversation we saw Roosevelt topping out at 12 or 1300 from projections.
Well, like maybe 14.
Yeah,
I'd have to go back and look.
So
I remember being surprised at how
what you-
low the number was.
Well, I think what you might be remembering is 2 years from now, they're going to be 1,200. Not that it's going to top off there, but it's like we can already see that if.
So this is a good
if
factual
current
question, because I thought I remember seeing that projection.
I don't
flattening.
believe we've got a 1,700 student projection.
Can we get access to the population forecasting? Just, can we all see it?
Well, we have that from our.
So
We
have it
have
from
it
last
somewhere,
year.
but I haven't seen it.
We have one from last March, and we're just due for an update at the end of March, but we can get you last year's data.
I'm just
But
curious why
it
you-
goes forward for 20 years.
Yeah, we can find out that data in terms of the projection. I'm just curious why your group would prioritize Roosevelt over Cleveland, Wilson, or Jefferson.
Well, it's also adding a racial equity and social justice lens. I mean, one of the things, if you look at just the median incomes and zip codes that you have, we were looking at also how are we making improvements at schools that are served predominantly underserved students versus schools that don't, and so it's using those parts.
But you proposed leaving Jefferson off the bond?
No?
We
No,
didn't weigh in.
On which one? And I guess I have the same question then in terms of like middle school redesign, second middle school in Southeast. I am sure those are also needs, but I'm just curious in terms of this going through this exercise, what made those a higher priority for you than continue?
I'll speak to that because there's 7 K-8s in outer Southeast. It's the largest concentration. So on the west side and the inner sort of east side and predominantly higher income neighborhoods, they never went to K-8s. They have always had middle schools, so you have a large concentration of students who are in the middle grades who are in under-enrolled programs and not in middle school facilities. So if you take a science lab.
So I want to be clear, I know there's a need there.
Yeah.
I'm asking why that need is prioritized over Cleveland, Wilson, and Jefferson. And you're just as you go
Well,
through this
I
exercise.
would say those schools served are the lowest income neighborhoods in Portland versus Wilson, Wilson or Cleveland. So it was an equity discussion about.
Was it very much based on income? Like,
Yeah.
But that's also not a question
income.
that's solved by facilities. I mean, we have work that we want to do in
They
terms of
don't-
enrollment balancing and reconfiguration.
But they're not
that
in
is
middle schools.
only intersects
They're not in
somewhat.
middle schools, though.
But-
The facility that serves.
I'm trying to get at the
education
larger
program.
picture, but if we change, because so what I'm hearing you put on the table is maybe income and it's sort of that equity criteria. We should really be looking at low income neighborhoods and making our investment in facilities in those neighborhoods first. But I guess I just want to play that out. Then when you say we're still doing high schools, what you really mean, we might be doing high schools at the end of the 30-year program rather than at the beginning,
So.
or in the middle where we are.
Well, I would say we're not suggesting like a wholesale do 30 elementary schools. We're saying there may be places where targeted investments need to be made. Finishing Roosevelt. We had a conversation about Tubman. So the freeway is going to be 50 feet even closer to it. And are we going to just if the state doesn't need it, are we going to just let it sit there? And I think we probably won't want to do that. Or outer Southeast, knowing. And it's probably not building a whole new facility. It is, what Dan, you said maybe it was 20, no, did you give us a number on that?
I did not.
You
Okay.
didn't because you didn't have one yet.
But it's not a complete retrofit, but it may be taking a K-8 facility and getting an appropriate sized media center and cafeteria, or converting a current K-8 building into an appropriate middle grade school.
So, if I can kind of jump in, and again, you know the need, but when we did Roseway Heights, we invested some money in there for IT, for a bunch of other things, because there's just was sort of a bottom line. And it
Science
was,
labs.
yeah, it was not a huge, new, beautiful thing. It was like basic bare bones. If we're going to deliver middle school services here, we have to at least be up to the standard. Is that? And
It wasn't over 50 million, it was probably less than 30.
No, it was
Oh.
18 for,
Well, that was.
Roseway Heights.
I don't know offhand.
yeah. But the,
It wasn't that high.
no, but together.
It was like
Roseway
20
Heights
for Tubman
and
Anyway, we were not,
Tubman.
just to clarify, we weren't talking about knocking a building down and building a whole new building, or even fully modernizing. We were talking about making a school appropriately kitted out for a middle school experience.
Which-
Like, if we're gonna do middle school, we need to do middle school.
Which is a figure that we need to have because we're already headed down the path of configuring Harrison Park after Kellogg. So what does that investment mean? I mean, that's a little easier one because it was a middle school, but.
Well, so is Roseway Heights, but we still had to put money in there.
Right. But it's not like $100 million investment, I guess is the point.
Right.
But it's not just we take the savings from this and like we can fix this middle school. Like you need to allocate.
There might be instances where the enrollment balancing work intersects
Absolutely.
with some targeted investments here. I mean, we've named some examples. Access Academy is another one.
And I think on the Tubman, I mean, this is really a question for staff, because if the freeway does happen in the next couple of years, how comfortable are we with if the state decides to do nothing? How comfortable are we with leaving students in that school where the freeway is even closer, the outdoor air quality is not going to be significantly improved, and so this is just a prudent planning of, looks like that's going to happen.
Although I would argue that we should be advocating for our students'
Absolutely.
interests so forcefully and so well that the state kicks in the cash.
We are.
Well, we're trying. I mean,
We are.
Scott and I have been at all the meetings. It's just.
Do you guys have a?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna, I just did what Maxine told me to do.
Always a good idea.
So, we were down with number one.
Down in a good way?
Down, continue along.
Down as in up.
Yeah, continue along. For number two, bringing back in seismic and accessibility to make 5 criteria. Number 3 was interesting, and I think our work ahead of us in the discussion back and forth is kind of, do we do all 3 high schools, or are we going to do 2 this one and another one the next one? Is kind of seems to be, and what do we give up, and pros and cons, all that stuff. I personally am still looking at what's A mean, what's B mean, what B means in terms of, my worry is that if we do I think there are huge reasons for doing all 3. And that's still my kind of starting point. But if I think we have a high risk of mechanical failures if we're doing the minimum, or an IT failure, I'm less willing to roll the dice so I want to find out more about the risks.
That's kind of where we were with high priority.
It's different than it was 10 years ago. Things have gotten worse. Shocked, I know. So I think that's the back and forth with staff that I personally need. In terms of other things to think about, in terms of elevating, we came up with sped classrooms. I think curriculum I go back and forth on. CTE. Under play structures, we know we have some middle school basketball courts that are cracked with weeds in them. It's not a big dollar item, but it's like we gotta inventory that and take care of it. And middle school conversion, we don't have a dollar amount, but that'll be on here. The Roosevelt piece, we need to look at enrollment, because I thought I heard that the classroom expansion that we're already going to do will take care of where they're going to be in 2 years from now. And the projections are flat for 10 years. I want to make sure that's where we are, and again, what the risk is around that before committing to saying we're going to do 1,700. I just want that information.
And we also know that we have, in the near future, enrollment balancing challenges between all of our high schools. So if we are rebuilding Jefferson, what does that look like? What is the enrollment? How does that affect Roosevelt? How does that affect Grant? You know?
And if we're rebuilding Jeff, is there room on that campus for Tubman? If we are going to look at moving because of the freeway, how did those play into that scenario as well?
Yeah, there's all of that is kind of on the table.
I just forwarded the enrollment report from last April. It shows through 2033.
2033.
So it's pretty flat, but the question is where do we think Roosevelt's going to be, because they've got that bulge freshman year, sophomore year, assuming that continues up, where are they going to be in 2 more years? And is that then going to flatline out at that level? And I just want to get that, our best information and projection down on that.
Parker, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just say about Roosevelt is, because it's geographically somewhat isolated, it's a little bit harder than I think the other high schools. Then we can shape some, just send those kids over there. Because when you're out in North Portland, it feels like you're in another
Absolutely, and that's
place.
why I said there's a risk factor in there that we should consider, because projections are projections.
And I thought we were building for 100-year schools, which I think it's really hard for us to imagine. Maybe the birth rate will pick up. There's a lot of things that we don't know.
Well,
and I mean, we are definitely a destination for people that are experiencing climate crisis. We have a lot of water here, a lot of perceived water, and I feel like we're going to see more and more. We're going to see more population growth for sure. I don't have the particulars on it.
That's a whole discussion about where kids end up, because we're not building housing for families in the city.
I do.
Parker, did you guys want to chime in on these 4 discussion topics?
Yeah, I think we all 3 had a couple of things.
You guys want to introduce yourselves, your group?
Sure. I'm Parker. I represent Benson on the DSC.
I'm Jackson. I represent Cleveland. I'm Terry. I represent Jefferson.
We were going over, we had a couple of things handed to us, and we went over the first one in more depth, which was the sample scenarios. We also went over the question sheet, which is what's currently up there. My perspective was, and I think the vast majority of students' perspective, is that obviously we would like to all have brand new, perfectly functioning schools for an indefinite amount of time. That's simply not feasible in any universe. I think that definitely from a student perspective, having to be in these facilities, these schools, where you're supposed to learn on a daily basis, that they really should at least be brought up to an acceptable standard, to where you don't have black mold or buckets full of rainwater, or falling ceiling tiles. That's a very common thing. Fun voice crack. It just so that it's safe, and sometimes the solution is to remove ceiling tiles, and that is a solution. It's not great. It doesn't look fantastic, but it works. What? Okay.
Think of it as an agility drill. It's part of
Yeah.
it.
It's an integrated PE curriculum. However, there are also restrictions in even bringing, the facilities up to basic standards. There's capital restrictions. I don't necessarily think that high schools should be prioritized to the extent that they currently are. At least from personal experiences, high schoolers can put up with things that 5-year-olds can't. Not that they should be disregarded, but 5-year-olds need to be taken care of, and there needs to be an emphasis put on that.
Jay, Jackson.
From the previous bonds, like the priorities we have, I'd say the high enrollment and the overcrowding. Since you're already doing the enrollment balancing, that wouldn't be a huge priority since it'd be taken care of anyways. Facility condition is probably the highest priority, I would say. Just trying to modernize the worst schools that we have. And probably also seismic performance rating, just because we know there's going to be a huge earthquake, obviously. And improving the worst schools again is probably the highest priority. And I would say that scenario C, where you only do one high school modernization with a reduced scope on a second one, would not be a great idea, just because the reduced scoped high school modernization would not probably completely modernize the schools, and would lead you to have to later modernize that school.
Don't defer 50% of your maintenance on 100% of your schools.
My turn. I agree with Jackson. I think that for scenario C, it's not exactly the best idea, because again, you'll have to go back and remodernize and renovate one of the schools, and that's just not something that necessarily we all have time for or patience for. And you'll be removing the students probably for half the year, and then they'll be going back to a building that's basically the same when you move them out to redo the school, but it's the exact same. So there's no point in doing that. I think that high enrollment and overcrowding is definitely shouldn't be one of the main priorities in this bond, because you're kind of improving everybody. So that's not really exactly going to be the worst of your problems for this bond. And facility conditions is definitely probably the highest priority, because some of the schools are kind of trash, because they're 5,000 years old. So I think that improving the conditions of the facilities at the different schools that you want to modernize would be definitely an improvement from where they are right now.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Because I'm not sure as a board we're already on sort of the same assumptions. Scenario A, where we finish Benson, do the multiple bachelor's graduation in 3 high schools, we use about $200 million for educational improvements and physical facility improvements. Right? I heard your group say you thought it didn't leave anything for those things. So I wanted to make sure that as
No, we said it just wasn't.
Not enough.
Yeah, it was 1.2 out of a 1.4.
So I might do just a real quick recap of, I think, some of the things that we've heard, maybe a couple points, and then see if I'm hearing things right. So the first topic is pretty straightforward. It sounds like two of the groups are more in favor of it, proceeding with the 3 high schools, and one group not necessarily. So that's aligning more with option A than the other 2 options for 2 of the groups. We've got some feedback on the criteria that was used before, with favorable input for seismic performance rating, accessibility, facility condition assessment, and then improving facilities for historically underserved students as a criteria. And then I think we have a little bit of both about the enrollment and overcrowding.
Just to be clear, Dan, on that one, the accessibility programs, we didn't really know exactly what that meant and didn't put it on our list.
Yeah, apologies. It was really ADA score.
Oh, so that's ADA?
Accessibility, yes.
Oh, okay.
Old terminology, I should change that. Descriptive. So number 3, I think largely I hear that the prioritization that's on the charts within the scopes of work seem reasonable. On the educational side, technology, curriculum, special classroom, performing visual arts, towards the higher end of that. And just, there are subject matter experts here tonight that might not always be at all future meetings, so if there is some specific questions about those and why those are the higher priority, that would be, now might be a good time to ask those questions. And then on the physical facility side, roofs, mechanical, security, seismic, ADA, asbestos, those being more towards the higher end. I think I've heard largely those seem right. SPED was emphasized by one group, and then a couple other items, learning environment being a priority. I want to touch on capacity a little bit. We haven't talked a lot about capacity. It's one of the scopes of work. The team that is working on the enrollment right now, that is going to be a multi-year effort. They did a presentation to the committee early on, said there isn't any sort of specific capital need right now that would be recommended. That said, throughout the course of this balancing effort and having an 8-year bond program, there might be future capital needs down the line. So I think what that speaks to is this need to have some funds set aside to address this need for the process and just for future enrollment needs. And how that can be captured in here is an amount of money that's set aside for that purpose or potentially the weapon program contingency.
I think the same could be said for suitability, right? Educational suitability. Like the subsets that came out of that analysis, like this building is deficient in these 2 areas.
Well, again, what you see here is staff saying, from the educational standpoint, here's the priorities. Technology, the initial priorities, things can change. Technology, curriculum, the special classroom spaces, the performing arts, those are the higher priorities. STEAM, CTE are lower priorities. Again, not saying that they're not important, not saying that they won't get something, but generally, that is where the most of the funds would be spent. Hearing that sounds right.
So I think maybe the point is more, if we look at enrollment projections and see that, on the west side, we don't have the capacity for K-5 in 8 years. We got, either we're putting in portables, shooting now, or, do we reserve some money for that if that's our expectation? At what point would we get that kind of analysis, which, we've got the projections. When would we at least get somebody saying, yeah, there's a pretty high likelihood that we will need?
Claire, do you have any input on when some of the capacity needs by region might be identified, especially obviously talking about capital needs?
So when we look at the capacity and the facilities that are in each region, there are enough. It means that boundary changes or program movement, but there are enough facilities in each region. So I would need to look closely at the Southwest, but that is in our third year. And I don't know that we've finished our analysis in that area. But the other two, they have enough capacity. The southeast and the northeast.
Trying to do the math on that. So there's southeast, northeast. Is north and northeast together?
We'll be doing north and northeast together.
Okay.
And the west, southwest.
All, okay. And then what about the northwest? West?
It's
Just
the
west?
lowest,
West,
lowest,
okay.
So if I can restate what I think I heard you
Yes.
say, Claire, so in theory, we have sufficient campus space if we go through the enrollment boundary work to make sure we're accounting for second comprehensive, additional PA conversions, identifying a unified home for access up front, et cetera.
And co-location of programs, movements.
Exactly, and movements and other programs, and so that's what this sum of money represents, is an ability to have that flexibility. These aren't full modernizations, but they're a conversion to create the right type of setting for each of these programs. In addition to some buildings that are not even online at the moment, that you see listed here without an amount, campuses like Smith, for example.
What's in there? Camps.
There's no minimum.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, but it's TBD.
Right, there's not a dollar amount.
Right.
So, you're saying on the east side, we're okay. And on the west side, you haven't completed the analysis yet.
I need to look closely at the southwest.
Although you do have that extra building there, so.
Right, but it would take certain
Yeah.
resources to bring them
Yeah.
up to you.
You're talking about Smith?
So, given everything, it would be nicer to know that sooner rather than
I
later.
totally
So,
agree with
like everything else, it'd be sooner rather than later.
Two questions about technology. Can you remind me what CR modernization means?
CR, classroom modernization?
Okay. Okay, and
That's the refresh cycle stuff.
It's not, no. Classroom modernization was taken as a project looking at, we've done great work at our high schools, and we continue to look at that particular piece of things. It still leaves a roughly 4,000 to 4,200 classrooms that this room, as rough as it is, would look like it's light years ahead of most of our classrooms out there. So when I talk about classroom modernization, it's talking about making sure every classroom has a wireless access point. Currently, only about 25% of our buildings have classroom or instructional coverage in their buildings. The rest are spotty. We don't have ubiquitous Wi-Fi in the buildings. So putting a wireless access point in every classroom, putting a mounted projector in every learning space that has wireless display, voice amplification, and some dedicated compute, so that every classroom we walk into has 21st century tools for teachers and students to be able to utilize.
sometimes 20th century.
Julie?
So there was a bill in the legislature which would have done a study about the harmful effects of Wi-Fi, and I know that David Morrison's been very involved in the issues with John Burnham. Do we have any sense of sort of what, if you looked out into the future, what the science is going to say in terms of like how we make sure that we're not making huge investments in things later on will be?
So the investments we're making now is not next generation technology. Wi-Fi is basic technology, which there is a massive body of evidence that the FCC is citing that talks about there is no harmful effects. There is no evidence that shows that it creates a detrimental effect. Right now, FCC is the governing body on that, and that's the guidance we take and follow. So even if we invest in these, it's not technology, it's not 5G technology, which has a little bit more concern, even though there's no evidence for that. It's still basic wireless. That there is no evidence, there's no medical proof that can counter, that says it's harmful. So FCC says it's safe for humans to be around, it's safe for children to be around. That's the guidance we're following.
So Don, what is technology infrastructure as differentiated from what you just described, modernization?
So technology infrastructure is the nervous system that every operation that goes on in this district that runs upon. So all of our internal networking, all of the switches that live out there, the wireless access points that we have out there are 10 years old. They're a 4-year device. We have a phone system that's going to fall out of support and be unsupported and likely fall over that needs to be replaced. We have a whole data center down there that has racks of servers and UPSs at all of our sites and all of those things. Everything that manages all of this falls under that infrastructure. I've been here a year, I've been studying, I've been looking at it. Decades of
Jerry rigging.
Yeah, if you're not intentional, you can't patchwork technology and the infrastructure that every bit of our day-to-day operates on. So when we talk about curriculum is not going to be textbooks. It's going to be digital curriculum. So if we're going to push forward on curriculum and how we're going to change the classroom and how we're going to change engagement, it's more than likely it's going to be digitally based. We have to have a robust infrastructure that can support that. When we talk about phone systems, it's our #1 system for life safety. So it's a high priority. And then that's not me even talking about the infrastructure that deals with security, cybersecurity, and data privacy. So there's a whole other realm around that. It's not the sexy stuff, it's not the stuff that anybody sees, it's the stuff that takes a good school district and makes it great because you have access to those resources to do the amazing things that we can do instructionally.
So I have one other thing I want to just add, our ERP system, our, full, how we keep things operating in our finance and HR and all those areas, it is 20 years old, and it's pretty soon going to be off cycle.
I'm sorry, ERP means nothing to me.
Enterprise Resource Planning.
It's our finance system, our human resources system. It's, making sure everyone gets paid every payday.
It's the backbone for your HR.
Our entire HR and
But
financials.
for both board members who I will forget what it stands for tomorrow, and for the public when we put something out, just a little.
What I put together, and I think what Gary put together was intended for
Can I
consensus.
specifically, just to follow those, because I was a little surprised by the dollar not there, but PeopleSoft is not, you're saying you're saying because we haven't updated our PeopleSoft to the latest versions?
Well, PeopleSoft is upgraded to version 9.0, so it's how...
That was a gallows humor laugh right there.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
PeopleSoft is upgraded to the latest version we can get. It is still a very old ERP in terms of what we're looking at. We're basing these numbers off of what Multnomah County just went through.
Yeah.
They're a very similar sized organization to what we do in terms of employees and the amount of dollars that run through their sort of, and they just spent $40.2 million on upgrading theirs. So they went to Workday. We have to look for a solution that's going to replace what we currently have in place. And it's not just, we're not looking at it as just an ERP. If we have the funds to do this, this is more of a workflow modernization. How are we going to do things different? How can we build the capacities?
It's not a today thing, it's a separate but there are, ERPs are notoriously oversold to governments, and so my caution as a board member who's been through 2 ER implementations would be to just be really cautious about what you buy. City Portland spent over $50 million buying SAP. SAP is absolutely not the system that it should have bought. It's made for multinational companies, and it doesn't serve what the city of Portland needs. And 10 years later, they're still recovering from that. I think there are a lot of much smaller systems that don't have the bells and whistles that actually work better for governments and government finance.
I couldn't agree with you more.
$50+ million for an ERP implementation. I'm glad you have it in here because I'm glad you're being conservative in the estimates, but I'd be interested in explaining a little more.
And there, yes, and we can talk about that, but there will be a full.
So I want to be mindful of us needing to wrap up here quickly, but along with technology.
Dr. Bailey.
Director Barris had a question.
Who had a question on that? Okay.
Scott, excuse me, I said.
So, no worries. So, I don't, I'm coming back to systems failures. And if this is a high-risk area, how can we not look at doing at least some kind of prioritization, if not the full $273,300,000? What do we have to do? I mean, there's just some things in here that we have to do, because if not, we're gonna have a systems failure, and then we're, lights out, or phones out, or so. I guess I'm looking for if there's any nuanced guidance within that 273 million, or if it's just, you want a firewall, you got to do this.
There's parts of that the total, I'm not.
And I know there's another document
is the curriculum. That's including the curriculum piece there. I've asked for 230, and when we talk about it, I'm not sure where we would cut. Where I normally go to is say, let's look at the one-to-one device deployment. We're already kind of at, in some regards, a one-to-one deployment, and about 35,000 of our Chromebooks are going to fall offline out of support in the next 1 to 2 years. So that might be the easy way to go. It's devices, but we have to have the resilient architecture. So when we bundle those things up, there are some, yes, I can prioritize a list of saying, here's what we absolutely have to do, and here's how I would prioritize it and bring that back. Happy to do that. But we are severely far behind the technical debt curve in Portland Public Schools.
Do these estimates take into account shaving off modernizations?
Could. I mean, shaving off, doing the classroom redesigns, and we absolutely could do that.
So before we move on, the other.
Did you mean that this number would be less if as we modernize?
Those I accounted for in those numbers. All the modernized schools, Kellogg,
but not prospective.
It would be, knowing that we were going to look at probably Cleveland, knowing that we were going to look at Jefferson and possibly Wilson, it was going to be a discussion of how we handle that. So those two schools were included in those numbers because we hadn't said anything for certain.
Just quickly before we leave this discussion, I don't see Dr. Valentino anymore, but Superintendent.
He's ready.
Oh, hi. Would you like to explain to us just a little bit about what these curriculum line items are?
Sure. So, per the comments that you made earlier in your group discussion, the objective is to, one, meet the expectations that a school district would have in ensuring that every student has current instructional materials, right?
The camera's right behind you.
That was intentional, thanks. And so, as we discussed before, some of the materials are more than 20 years old. So bringing them current is one of the objectives. The second one is to put Portland Public Schools on the state's adoption cycle. And with these resources, we're able to then track the 7-year cycle so that we are no longer playing catch up. And so the $42 million is not for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. It's for the 8-year span that covers the 8 curricular areas that we actually adopt for. And the life of the bond fits right within that. And so the cost, actually, the analysis for the cost was based on work, extensive work done by Lynette Engstrom, who spoke to dozens of, well, maybe not dozens, but multiple publishers, and looked at the historical data on the expenses that Portland took on when it was purchasing resources in the past. And so this adoption cycle would begin with math next year, followed by science, followed by social studies, and we would carry that out until we complete the cycle. And then we would be able to start again in the 9th year. Any questions? Oh, thank you.
So
So
Thank you.
Before we move on, I guess from a timing perspective, we don't have very much. I think this is a really useful conversation about it, but I also think there is some disagreement or differences between maybe in terms of emphasis and criteria. So I guess my question is a little bit more of a process question than a timing question. Can you walk us through the calendar a little bit in terms of when? I know we've got a lot of community engagement coming out, which can help inform this process. But sort of working backwards, we need to have a referral by May. Well, we don't have to. The goal is to have a referral by May. There's a lot of community engagement that's going to happen in the next couple months in terms of meetings with the public and meetings with particular stakeholder groups. As a board, we're going to be taking that information, hear that, sort of come up with the bond package. Staff, though, also, you got some guidance today, but I think you also heard some, well, maybe we need to wait a little bit longer to work through this.
I think a little bit high level, the intention of going back to this graphic of what we think the big ingredients are that the board's going to want to be able to make a decision. So intention is to come back with a staff recommendation, maybe two, maybe there's a couple options, but to have something, these are just really sample scenarios, they should be wildly off, but be a little more concrete, have staff say, okay, this is what we think the recommendation is, or again, give a couple options. And but we'd like to do that if I think it's feasible to do it at the next committee meeting, maybe it doesn't have to be the one after that. Then you would have that component, and then we get the community input as that rolls in to be able to inform you, or what does that change. I don't know if
okay. Would it be helpful for people to summarize 30 seconds each board member, a little bit sort of where we are on this?
Let me clarify one thing. So Dan, on that third one, cost data, we've seen the FCA data, but we haven't created a prioritization of that. But on the master plans, we still have not seen that. We know it's still general, but we do have a more refined level of cost estimates that will be available in the next week or so, right?
Yes, we can have those high-level estimates available. And we are also meeting with the Bond Accountability Committee next week. So we're hoping to take all of our different scopes of work and refine them all, so we'll have better data next time.
So I think what I'm really lacking is more this sort of what's the basic, using the sort of parent standard, but I want my child in that school, but it just meets the most basic standard. And I guess I can't tell that from either the cost data or the data that we've received so far. And so that's what I'm just looking at. It's like, are we, making a big bet one place, but somewhere else we haven't met the most basic standards? And I see on Facebook a lot of things that tell me like, boy, that needs to be fixed. But I can't tell from looking at the data, like whether we're actually going to be addressing those things.
So the question is whether that bright line actually exists. I mean, what I think you're saying is there's a bright line and we should be able to draw it. I think the reality of the schools and the condition we are with over $5 billion of unmet needs, there are a lot of schools that are not where we want them to be. And if we spend $1.4 billion fixing all of those things, and not modernizing anything, I still don't think we can get there. So I think it's much more of a gray area. I think that there are definitely facilities that are worse and better, and we have that information. But I'm not sure if staff is going to be able to drop everything beyond this needs to be fixed right away, and everything above it doesn't. Because even the people above it are going to complain and reasonably bring forward the heating issues and cooling issues and other things.
Well, I think it's nuanced. I agree. I don't think it's a bright line, but I do think that we have some sort of standard. I mean, like another just data point would be on the ADA accessible, like do we have, we've talked over and over again about having at least one, fully ADA accessible school in every cluster, and so just knowing what some of those standards are, to me that would be helpful, but I agree. I mean, there's all, we're never going to satisfy everyone, but I do think there is a base level that we could probably mostly us agree as parents. That's what we would expect. That we'd be comfortable sending our own children to that school.
Julia, every parent I know's base level is that if the big earthquake comes, my kid is going to be over lockdown. And our schools do meet code.
code.
They don't,
But
they
not all of
don't.
it
Not
do.
for-
Because there's like, you know, the asbestos, the lead in the water, I mean, it's just, there's, I think, some things that, and having sat through the Health, Safety, and Accessibility Committee that was in existence from 2017 to 18, I think they did provide some great criteria of like, hey, this asbestos that any student has access to, we're getting it out of here. But if it's in a crawl space that nobody's gonna be, we're gonna leave that in there. So I think staff was able to create some reasonable criteria. And then, you know, it's a value judgment of how, you know, where the line gets drawn.
So I'll start. I'll try and be quick. I mean, I think this exercise was excellent. So I really appreciate how staff structured it to sort of go through and look through the criteria, and it got us really thinking. I think some really good conversations we obviously need to continue as forward. I think for me, and having done a lot of asset work and sort of trying to figure out ways that government can solve it, that the hardest thing is that when you finally start finding revenue, which is very, very hard to do. The district did an amazing job in 2012 and 2017 getting voters to increase the tax rate and then keep it here and say, look, we've got a plan. It's a 30-year plan. It's a long plan, but we have a plan. I think the problem is that as we're continuing down there, the expectations are increasing and people are looking at those dollars and they're saying, but I want this and this and this and this, and every one of those things needs to be fixed. We're not going to fix them in the same year. So the fundamental question for us as a board really is what do we prioritize? Which brings me back to the promises that were made as a district. And I think one of the interesting things is none of the current board members, including myself, were on the board when those promises were made. But as a parent, I know those promises were made. And in 2012, when I voted for the bond, in 2017, we were told we're doing these high schools and we will finish all of them. And that is the plan. And I think the rationale behind that, of hitting the most students, actually hits our equity goals, it hits the most students, it disrupts the least students, and I think it's an incredible achievement for the district. So I completely agree that there are other things we need to do. I want to make sure we have some of that money for health and safety and fixing some of the worst. But for me, walking away from that, I think it would be a huge, I think we owe it to we owe it to the parents to sort of continue on that path that PPS laid out moving forward. And so I don't, for me, the scenario that includes finishing up to 2017, finishing Benson, and going forward with 3 high schools is where I believe.
I found what Parker said about taking care of kindergartners and what Director Brim Edwards said about, you know, prioritizing those schools where we know that we have some of the highest poverty, most underserved students. Very compelling, and yet I fall very much with where Director Scott is around that sort of promise of doing the high schools. And if we do an 8-year bond and we don't have all 3 high schools on it, that means the next bond for one of those high schools will be 2028, and that's 16 years from, I mean, that's halfway through the 30-year plan. And I think there's this sense of public trust that we need to honor as a district that focuses on that. I would really like us to have in-depth conversations about what does Jefferson look like? How does Tubman fit into that? What are the ways that we can do some of the work that will hit those highest need schools? And can we make that happen within the 1.4 billion? But I really think we need to do all 3 high schools on this one.
I generally concur, although I think there's a lot of work yet to be done about what that looks like for each one of those high schools and how much that costs, and how each of those buildings is different, and what our enrollment is, and what our overall student enrollment is likely to be, and what work do we have to do through enrollment balancing at the high school level. I think those questions all play into this bond question very significantly. And I think that the curriculum piece is very compelling, and I totally support that, and the technology piece. I don't know about Dawn's full wish list, because I don't know enough about all of those components. I know we're in bad shape, and I know some of it is like system failure, like really operational effectiveness is clearly extremely compromised by the poor state of that and the lack of investment. And then with the curriculum piece, I think, you know, it does touch every student, and it puts us on the cycle that we should have been on, that we can responsibly refresh on a 8-year cycle. And that's what our kids deserve, and it's it's a modest amount of money relative to what we're looking at in terms of the other capital investments. And then I think this category of capacity is really compelling too, and I'd like to see us get a little more definition around that. Some of it would be investment as we reconfigure to middle schools. Some of it is how are we repurposing buildings that are coming back under our control from leases. A little more information about what we need to do to take care of those, I think is important. And just the other note on the high schools is that when we do the full modernizations, we get everything. And all those students in those buildings get everything. They get the state-of-the-art, seismic and technology, and all the other things that we're looking at piecemeal. So I think this is a good first conversation to sort of see where everybody's coming from. I think they get universal design in those two. I think we also still have some differentiated work to do around our special education, not just classrooms, but how we're able to serve all of our students. Anyway.
Do you mind if I go next because I'm not feeling well and I'd like to leave?
Yeah.
I really wanted to appreciate Parker for what he said too. I felt like it showed intelligent, emotional intelligence that I really appreciate. And also agree that, we should consider spending our dollars with younger students. I also understand what we said about, modernizing the high schools, that's important, but if we don't shore up our other schools that are in poorer condition, especially seismically, and we have an earthquake, it won't matter because we won't have students who will get into those high schools. If I were gonna rank how we made this decision, I would put seismic performance at the very top, followed very closely by improving facilities for historically underserved kids. And also, some focus on, educational improvement for those same underserved kids, that if we could make improvements that would help those kids in SPED classes. I just, it's a big decision, and I think that I'd really also like to hear from the community members of the Jefferson cluster in particular, as to what they're thinking and what their needs are. I'd like to see more data. The population data would be really helpful for me, I guess. Did you say you sent it, or we have it? I feel like I feel like I don't have enough information to make a decision, but I would just at first glance focus on making those seismic improvements to guarantee the health and safety of the largest number of students. And I'm going to excuse myself.
Okay, I feel better. But good job taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I'll go do that.
So when we've explored the seismic improvements before, the exercise went into what would it take to, without a full remodel, to go in and bring a building up to that level 3. It's like, it would be so inefficient to do that. It would just drag our program out for decades. And so that to me is a priority that pushes me to full modernization, not to piecemeal. And a couple of months ago, 2 months ago maybe, I sent out an email to the board that had high school enrollment projections. I can resend that to you because now it's sort of more, it's buried back there somewhere. That kind of puts some perspective on where we're going there. So again, I start off do all 3 high schools, and my only caveat is, and when we go out to the public, I think for each of these items, we need a sort of, what does this mean? What are the consequences of not doing it? What are the risks of not doing it? Outlined. I mean, there's 30 million or something like that of pavement work that didn't make the cut for any of it. And I presume that says the worst that's going to happen is I'm going to trip over a crack in a sidewalk and, bloody my knee. Okay. I can live with that. I can live with that versus our whole IT system crashing around us. So that's what I need to, I mean, if there's enough of that risk, that's going to move me from A to B. I also just have really mixed feelings about putting curriculum in, as opposed to saying we got to do this in our operational side, as opposed to a bond thing, because we put off the buildings for so long, and that's just it's just a really tough decision. And I'm not going to be, if somebody's on the other side of that, I'm not going to be mad about it. But the need on the building side is so great, and we put it off. We've sacrificed buildings for 25 years now, and look where it's got us. Sigh. That's where I am. So a little more nuance to help us, and I think the public can understand. Because I can just imagine being a parent and going in and seeing, oh, do I want this or want that? If I don't know what all this IT stuff actually means in terms of day-to-day operational stuff and whatnot, I could wait or not. I just need more explanation of what the risks are. But great work, and this is I thought it was a really productive session to move our thinking along. Thank you.
Julia?
So my criteria that I would approach this would be facilities conditions. Well, first of all, the overarching sort of racial equity and social justice, because I feel like our facilities reflect income levels in some ways in our district. So then, second would be facilities conditions, health, safety, accessibility. The middle school conversions in the parts of the district where students haven't had adequate middle grades facilities for over a decade. A continuation of the high school program, so not stop it, but continuing it to build that out, and textbooks and materials. And one thing I guess I want to talk about the perception of what people think we promised, because I'm looking at I just pulled out the polling from 2017 and also the polling that we just did a month ago. And overwhelmingly, voters in Portland Public Schools prioritize sort of health, safety, and accessibility. Modernization in 2017 was, I think, asked if it was one of the most important. Only 8% of the respondents said modernizing Benson, Lincoln, Madison was, that was their priority. I think the school district made the right decision at the time, but there wasn't this widespread, this is what's driving everything, and even a month or two ago, still focusing on safety, mitigating potential hazards, increasing emergency preparedness, way outscored finishing the modernization projects. And that's not a reason not to do it, but it's just, I think, speaks to the public's perception of what they did. When I read these poll numbers, it doesn't read people thought that we promised the modernizations and that's one of their highest priorities. So I guess I would just temper it. Again, I think we should continue on with it, but mixed in with some of these other needs. And I think about how, I'm going to be going out and talking to voters in all areas of the district, that I want to have the ability, I think we all want the ability to say that there's going to be improvements across the board. We're going to make some big bets in a couple places, but also your student will see either new textbooks or some sort of health and safety or accessibility improvements in your school. And I'm just going to go back to maybe what Angela said last time, is that ADA got passed a long time ago, and we really need to continue to make progress so that our students who need accommodations in their schools can actually access our buildings.
So, I guess I'll start with 2 things. One, PPS has neglected everything for decades. And part of it has been, so part of it is, you know, Q rant number 1. The state has failed to adequately fund K-12. But even within that, I'm not convinced that PPS has used its scarce resources as efficiently and effectively as they could have in the past. So, I mean, I would like to do all of it. So there you go. But we can't, obviously. So the second thing I would start with is I think it's worth noting that when people were talking about the 2012 bond package, for those of us who lived through it, what was going on at the time was the beginning of a reconsideration of the K-8 reconfiguration. And it was becoming clear that the reconfiguration had been problematic at best. So at the time, we had just gone through a high school redesign in 2010. So when we were talking about the 2012 bond package, the only group of schools that people actually knew what they were going to be 5 years from that point was high schools. So it made complete sense to focus the bond work on the high schools because we all knew we were going to have high schools. K-8s, K-5s, who the hell knows? I mean, everything was up in the air. So what made sense then does not necessarily make sense now, 8 years later. And then through the life of this bond, 16 years later. And I was not actually in favor of the 2017 bond continuing, you know, on the path without really thinking about other needs that had become apparent. But that's what we did. And while I agree that there are expectations out there, I think there is also a public expectation that PPS be a functional school district. And I think, you know, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we are probably on the cusp of multiple essential critical system failures. And for my money, I'd like to avoid that. And if that means that we have to reassess the primary focus on high schools, then I think we need to do that. And none of it is sexy. I mean, there's, you know, it's great to walk into a brand spanking new building. But it would be nice if that brand spanking new building could function and that we had an HR infrastructure where we could actually hire people in a timely fashion. And that when you bring in your laptop, it will actually function because, you know, I mean, there are so many things that I think I'm hearing are on the brink of collapse. So I'm not in favor of collapse. So if I
I've already said on that cheery note.
I'm not in favor of collapse.
No collapse.
Yes.
No collapse.
No collapse.
Finally, you've unified the board.
which means buildings as well as other infrastructure. So I guess if I were gonna prioritize things, I'd probably start with roofs. And you can do a little seismic upgrade when you do roofs.
A lot.
So that's, you know, that's a twofer. We have had multiple buildings that are, well, Kellogg, for example. for want of a roof, we had to knock down the building.
Right.
That's inexcusable. So heat is good in the winter. That's really good. So the critical systems that are on the brink of failure, I think tech infrastructure, I think curriculum. I can't imagine when we will have another chunk of cash that we can throw at curriculum that is, I mean, I've always heard curriculum is 10, 20, sometimes 30 years out of date. And I just want to remind people the Soviet Union does no longer exist, and it would be good for our students to know that. I think we're making the shift to middle school, and we have to be real about making sure that we have enough money to actually make it happen. And there you go.
Can you run with that, Dan?
I think so.
And all the listeners.
Capture it all.
Yeah. I have a question. Do we get a contractor to bid on, to take on Kelly's roof? The roof at Kelly, they sent out for bid. Did we get anyone to submit?
I don't know that specific project. None of our projects that we've bid so far have not had bids, but I'll
I just
check
know
on
that their plan is to get a new roof this summer, so I was talking about roofs. That's one of my things is, I think roofs we have.
Yeah, we have a number of roofs this summer. I'll double check.
Yeah, that was one of their concerns. So as we talk about roofs, it's, do we actually have the capacity to get this done?
Yes, like very brief, like 3 to 5 minutes. We'll reconvene. I'll roll it down.
Should I write that? Double check.
So we're not sure if this is live, just for a heads up.
Even if I turn late,
So, as the guy with the big one. No, I usually push.
I'm not as good.
We're
Okay. That's Scott and we're Andy.
they're good. Okay. Well, then they'll cut that. Over there. Anyhow, just so you can see it.
Claire, one thing, I'm sorry. We neglected to ask for public comment at the beginning of the bond work session, so is there anyone in here who wanted to offer public comment on the just concluded bond? Okay, Angela? Yeah, but we did say we would do public comment. Yes. You can stay where you are, or you can come up here, whichever you're most comfortable with. Of course, do whatever you want, Angela. Or you can just use this chair next to Rita. Whatever you want.
You want to be on camera?
You're welcome to take my seat. Here, just take my seat. Oh, yeah. I said that here. She's back here.
I will visualize. First of all, I think that as challenging as everything is, it's a wonderful city that people can have such robust conversations and that we can be thinking about asking for these investments, and it's a city I believe a great deal in. My name is Angela Jarvis Holland. I'm the Executive Director of All Born In, and for the last 20 years I've been working to try and make our communities and schools more inclusive in lots of different ways. And I'm going to give you a little quick story. 30 years ago, this year, which will be significant if you are pitching a bond in it this year, 30 years ago, Jennifer, an 8-year-old, crawled up the steps of the Capitol. And that was towards the end of a movement to try and open the doors to people's rights that have disabilities. That crawl up the steps was just so powerful visually and emotionally that it was the tipping point for the passing of the ADA bill. That's 30 years ago, and it's past due in Portland Public Schools. This is on my wall in my office, and I look at it every day. This is the signing of ADA. Tom Owen was the photographer. It was his niece that crawled up these steps. These photos, there's only 250 of them that exist. They're signed by the two widows of the two men that did the work to do this, get this bill passed. They've been put in this was put in my charge. These are only given to organizations that will commit to keep bringing this message forward, even in the face of discouragement, even in the face of invisibility. So I took a sacred charge by having this on my wall. And I'm not here to guilt trip. I'm here to just say, this is a moral, civil rights issue, and you don't have anyone in a wheelchair in here, and the tyranny of the majority could miss this opportunity. Any amount of input, and this happens also in race issues, in other justice issues. We have to think who's at the table, who's not at the table. PPS has solved their issue by segregating children and sending them away from their schools. You don't not educate them, but you make them invisible. So you have to know that you don't even see it. When you go to parent night and you're up on the second floor in that classroom, looking at your kids' stuff, you don't see the grandparent that couldn't be there. You don't see the father that has MS and couldn't be there. So they don't challenge you, they're just invisible. So I wanted to make them visible, and I want to just pass around. This is my son Daniel. This quote says, "We cannot seek achievement for ourselves. Our ambitions must be broad enough to include the aspirations and needs of others for their sake and for our own." And if you look how old, my son's the one in the glasses there. That was years and years ago, and at his school, there was a young girl who had cerebral palsy. If she did not learn how to go up the stairs over the summer when her class was graduating, she would be sent away to another school. This is not a rant about special ed, but it means that you say things like, we have to look after those kids in special ed. Special ed is responding to architecture by segregating kids, making them invisible again. What does it say to 21st century schools? What does it say to the kindergartners that don't have a child with a disability in their class? So there's a huge cost and impact that's generational. And we need to fix this at kindergarten and see our kids included. Those kids end up on buses, traveling an hour or more sometimes, and when a school grows, that's the program that gets moved. It's a convenient flex point in a system, but it's dysfunction. And I believe, I've spoken with Guadalupe, I've spoken with Jonathan, I've been on a lot of visioning sessions. I believe your vision is bigger than this. And I'd offer that you need to pay for some of the consultancy, you need to pay for somebody with a disability to be involved in your conversations and raise the level of your understanding, because I think it would really be helpful to every student. I always feel confident when I say I want 21st century schools that meet the needs of a child with a disability. I'm saying I want schools that meet everybody's needs. I also know this is the only area where you are required by law to have a plan, and your ADA plan that you are required by law to have could intersect with the bond. So this could be a point of education for everybody if you invested properly in something you are already required to do. And I will offer grace to everyone. Until Daniel was born into my life, I felt that I understood a lot about justice and social justice and felt pretty right on about some things. But I have learned so much since he's been in my life, and a lot of it is lessons from people with disabilities. And the last thing I'll say is the biggest saying from the disability community, and Daniel said some of these at meetings with you, nothing about us without us, and free our people. And now you cannot say these kids are invisible anymore because I've shown you some. You cannot say you didn't understand that issue as you rank these terrible choices. But I'm just going to leave it with you that this is a moral and civil rights issue that needs your attention urgently.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other public comment? Okay, come on up. We're going to need to keep it to 3 minutes. Ailey has her timer on. Thank you.
That's fine.
Go ahead.
Good evening, my name is Mike Rosen and I'm here representing the PPS Climate Justice Committee. I have a professional background in natural resource protection and a PhD in environmental science and engineering. As one of the single largest real estate holders in Portland, Portland Public Schools is a major contributor to the city's carbon emissions, and our facilities lag in energy efficiency with long-term costs to the school district. We can reverse that trend by committing the right resources to the right efforts in a connected ecosystem of work through the 2020 bond. The school district has an opportunity to target some of the 2020 bond funds in a way that helps us improve the efficiency of our schools and buildings, reduces waste, lowers our carbon footprint, and reduces long-term facility operational costs. The good news is that PPS has been busy in the last handful of years improving its facilities. An updated facilities condition assessment is completed, and a building automation contract to provide daily building energy metrics is now in place. The monitoring gives PPS a baseline informing us about our energy spend every month in every building moving forward. The Oregon Department of Energy's SB 1149 monies and the Green Energy Technology Fund continue to provide important financial resources for the work underway. In addition, the Portland Clean Energy Fund has been passed, and the district is applying for a significant and potentially ongoing new funding source for this kind of work. In Amoresco, the PPS Energy Efficiency Auditing Company is currently in its 13th phase of energy efficiency work with PPS. That work has largely been done at the margins with modest resources, so while impressive, it is just a small fraction of what PPS could do with a more significant commitment of staff and financial resources. Specifically, we can take this data and foundational work and transform it into positive outcomes for PPS on a timeline that keeps pace with our need to make our buildings and operations more sustainable and as responsive to the district's commitment to action on climate. Based on that analysis, we can recommend what it would take to do energy efficiency upgrades, add renewable energy where it makes sense, and begin to provide a more integrated approach to updating buildings in ways that also help meet related sustainability goals and reduce operational costs. In short, PPS has historically approached this laundry list of resources as a constellation of silos. However, with our data analytics matched with available funding opportunities, we can connect those dots in a way that we've never been able to before. The district has made foundational investments in its health and safety needs from the 2017 bond. The new clarion call is to build on that with more energy efficiency, more renewables, less waste, and a smaller carbon footprint. Voters care about this, our students are demanding it, and the bond can help us address all of this in an accelerated way that is commensurate with the growing urgency of the climate crisis. The only way that PPS can make the kind of change it needs to its utility spend, its contribution to reducing waste, and its carbon footprint is by committing a portion of the next bond to get this work done now. The clock is ticking. Let's not let this opportunity pass us by. Thank you. And I edited this to keep it down to 3 minutes, so I have the full testimony here for the board.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Come on up. Welcome.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Amy Higgs. I'm the Executive Director of the Eco School Network. For the past 10 years, we've been supporting parents and students and teachers in PPS and in nearby districts who lead efforts to make their schools greener and healthier. 164 trained parent volunteers work with students to lead waste reduction initiatives, school gardens, walk and bike to school efforts, and student green teams. More and more students and parents have come to us in the past 2 years, doubling the size of our network. We're hearing that they're experiencing eco-anxiety at a level we have not seen before. As the climate change impacts become more visible, we're seeing kids with rational fears about whether our planet will be safe and habitable for them. Some are getting counseling or getting medicated for eco-anxiety. I applaud the good work you've done to create safe and healthy schools with clean air, great security systems, seismic resilience, and much more. But let's not ignore the elephant in the room that threatens the long-term health and safety of every PPS child, climate change. Now, as we're starting to include climate justice in the curriculum, students are learning more and noticing the ways in which their schools are not set up to minimize CO2 emissions. A study that I co-authored for the Journal of Environmental Education in 2006 showed that students who learned about environmental problems while in a school building that did not model environmental responsibility were more likely to become hopeless and apathetic about the environment. When students lose trust in their community's willingness to act, they often lose hope that they can personally make a difference, and they stop trying to make a difference. In contrast, at schools where the buildings and staff modeled sustainability, students were much more likely to be hopeful and to take daily stewardship actions. I appreciate the work that is being done through this bond to integrate green features into school buildings. And in deciding how to spend the remaining bond dollars and what to include in the next bond, I hope that you'll carefully consider students' future health and safety as a key part of this picture, and take every opportunity to shape buildings that shrink carbon emissions and model sustainability. By creating spaces where students can grow food and find nature in their schoolyard, spaces with durable recycling and composting bins, dishwashers for durable trays, infrastructure that encourages active transportation and electric vehicle use, and spaces that are powered by renewable energy instead of the typical fossil fuel infrastructure. Our students can help implement these solutions, and they can monitor and measure their impacts. EcoSchool Network volunteers stand prepared to assist in the student engagement. I'm so grateful for your time this evening. Mike and I are excited about this opportunity to advance the PPS vision to prepare students to lead change and improve the world. But their ability to lead change and improve the world depends on their ability to maintain hope. Not only do we have a moral responsibility to help students maintain hope, but their future depends on it. The school board has an incredible opportunity to help students see that their community is willing to take bold actions to safeguard their future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What happened to Deb? There's Claire. I think there's 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Those are the only people who said they wanted to offer public comment. How long do you want me to set the timer for?
I can do it in 2 minutes.
I just want to finally protocol and say, and I've talked to Claire about this, we can do those energy-saving projects that cut our operating costs. The payback period is pretty short. The issue is we spend bond money on it and save on the operational side. If we fed back in, it would be basically a zero net in terms of actual net bond expenditures, but it would get us in a better place. We just need to do it.
Do it with our modernizations. Yeah, we can do it.
Okay. So on to enrollment program balances.
Okay. Sorry about the time.
That's okay. I bring before you the second draft of the proposed scope of work, as well as there was a Q&A piece that was included in the agenda packet. Those are the questions that were included in the sticky note process we had a few weeks ago. So what we're bringing back to you is a scope of work for enrollment and program balancing process that would begin in the spring of 2020 with Southeast schools. And in the second year, we continue to the north and northeast areas. And then in the third year, we continue to the west, southwest areas. Why are we doing this? Because of over and under enrolled schools throughout the district, as well as the access program was relocated and needs to be reunited and resituated. And we have a new middle school that's opening in 2021. So we need to identify its feeder pattern and engage the school community in that process. So why now? Because of the opening of Kellogg Middle School in August 2021. And we are committed to addressing the problems identified and to better serve our students. We're basing our work and our core values of our vision, and we have outcome goals of optimizing the use of facilities, supporting equitable programming, and minimizing program co-location. Now with that, I would ask the board to let us know what, as you review the second draft, if you have thoughts, if you have suggested changes. Our hopes is to bring this forward back to next week's board meetings for approval, maybe even on the consent agenda if we get enough consensus built around it tonight.
Claire, can you highlight sort of what's different about the first draft that we brought to the board?
So this is a much more detailed scope of work. I would say we have worked with a couple of board members, one that's been involved in the policy committee and one that's on the task force and working with the staff committee that is preparing for the enrollment and program balancing process. And they've made, along with all the edits that were made on sticky notes, they've also, from their experience in prior processes in this district, have made suggested changes to this second draft.
So I want to touch on one of the bullet points because we just had a public comment that mentioned it, and that's specifically around creating, as much as we can, special education pathways that keep kids with their cohort, would allow siblings to, if a child is placed for special education services in a school outside of their neighborhood school, that their siblings would have the option to travel that same path, so that families could choose to have one school. But they'd be with as much as possible, stay with the same cohort all the way up through high school, and that we stop balancing enrollment on the backs of our kids in focused classrooms. There's always going to be issues that come up because population goes up here, not there, but this should be what we shoot for.
You're looking for feedback?
Yes.
Is that the purpose?
Yes.
So I like the core values. And maybe I would even start with that, just as a framing the conversation. I had two things that I think are missing on why we're doing this. One of them will be no surprise. There's a nod to the new middle school opening, and then it talks about engaging school communities that may be potentially reconfigured from K-8s to K-5s, but I don't believe we can open catalog and choose half the schools to go from K-8s to K-5s and just keep the rest. So I think the other work, as long as you're out there, but it's the same as schools, is to also look at a second middle school and just finish the work of reconfiguring them into the appropriate size, grade configuration. And then the other issue that I don't think it's in conflict, but I'm concerned that we're making these massive investments in 1,700 student high schools, and we don't have any plan. This was a discussion in the 2016 Bond Stakeholder Advisory Group about, setting up an enrollment plan so that we knew that when Benson opened, that we had a plan that there would be 1,700 students that wouldn't kill Jefferson and Madison and Roosevelt, and we still don't have that. And so I think if we don't get started, we're going to have a school that's we don't enroll. And then I think there's some pretty compelling data that the high school principals have put together that show that the range of size of high schools has actually gotten worse, and that in terms of programmatic equity on a whole host of levels, that some enrollment balancing or potential adjustments of Jefferson's its co-enrollment areas changing could both relieve some over-enrollment in some schools and also provide Jeff with a more equitable school size. But again, I think, Benson is the biggest thing that's gonna happen soon, that we don't yet have a plan that's not going to really have a significant impact potentially on some of our other schools that we want to be fully enrolled and have equitable programming. So I would.
So, I'm sorry, are you?
Yeah, so I would just include why are we doing this? I wanna make sure we're intentional about the high school piece, because we don't want to end up with, we built a bunch of high schools that the students are, some of them are stuffed and other ones of them are.
So with opening.
Can I just add on that for 1 second before? So this is something that I've been focusing on a little bit for a while on our high schools, and I was glad to see in the outcome goals, our high school is part of the rebalance. Yes, because we have been not terribly clear about that with regard to this enrollment balancing scope of work, but I don't see where it is directly connected in the approach and sequence of the work. I do see definitively that our high school is part of the rebalance, yes, but it would be nice to see it elaborated. What does that really mean, and how does it fit in a more specific way?
I think the first draft had the words K-12 in the optimized use of facilities K-12, and I think that's been edited out, so we might need to put that back in. The other thing I was going to say was the middle school programming in the southeast, the second middle school. It's that will cause some adjustment from most likely involving between Franklin and Madison, where Franklin, as we set feeder patterns for those 2 middle schools in the southeast. So that would most likely create a shift between those 2 high schools.
We just need to call it out. Yeah.
Well, you could also, moving grants boundary as well. I mean, there's.
Correct. I'm starting with the southeast, but yes.
But that's a natural consequence of the reconfiguration around Kellogg and Harrison Park.
Under approach and sequence of work, under number 2, the phased implementation plan, it does call out the need to prepare for opening a second middle school.
Okay. I was just looking at the why are we doing this?
Yeah. You're right. Sure. Were you imagining a second one opening at the exact same time?
No,
no, but I
agreed that's.
Well, but I think it's closely sequenced after it because we are going to have a. I think it says that.
We will need to complete the southeast and the northeast north in order to create the boundaries for those middle schools. Yeah, southeast.
But
yes, we'll have to go into the second year.
Yeah. But when? Within the next 2 years.
Right. I was just trying to get it called out in the why are we doing this? Both the high schools and the second. I've got it. Middle school. Again, I sometimes think that people just seeing that they're in the plan gives.
Julie, is the language on page 3 appropriate?
Support equitable.
I don't have a page.
Schools that will be.
We just need to be consistent all the way through, and I think.
Right. We need to pass Kellogg at the same time we prepare for opening the second middle school.
Yeah, it's spelled out.
She wants it in the why are we
Yeah,
doing
I guess, yeah, we should just have a common thread throughout, so if we say, why are we doing this, X, Y, and Z, and then here's the approach and sequence, and it's the same thing, but it's talking about the.
But the why are we doing this is more about our values.
Well, and then maybe in that bullet point, I'm wondering, Director Burnett, a new middle school is opening in 2021, this is on page 2. We need to identify its feeder pattern, which is its and feeder are 2 words. And engage the school communities that maybe potentially are figured from K-8s to K-5s and look at a second middle school in the future. Do you want to add that to that line?
Yeah, because to me, this is just around, it's whatever the 3 or lucky 4 K-8s, and then the other ones are going to be, and literally they are going to be probably the lowest, in the lowest income zip codes.
So perhaps as well as begin drafting a plan for a second middle school in the same, to just add a sentence there to that bullet point to kind of say, this is what we're doing immediately, and we're not gonna just leave it there, there's a future plan for that.
But we have that under the phased implementation.
I know, but I think Director Brim Edwards is asking us to call it out earlier to help people know that we're not gonna forget them. Is that correct?
I've got the suggestion written down.
Thank you.
And it's, we also have some Chavez to resolve one way or another, which I'm not sure how that's going to end up, and Beverly Cleary and Laurelhurst, if we want to make a change there or not, is also something that's on the table.
But that's after this scope of work.
Yeah, so, well.
This is meant to be a three-year plan.
I know, but north after southeast, not.
Yeah.
Well, it's northeast.
I was going to say on page 3, under minimize program co-locations, I know that the sort of impact of co-located is called out on the top of page 2 with that clear bullet point. But I think you've done a masterful job of moving a lot of this language to be really student focused, but I find that minimize program co-locations bullet on the top of page 3 lacking in the student focus. So I know it's in the document already, but again, sometimes people skim. So I think if we could have something like, we're doing this to reduce isolation and offer a more robust programmatic experience to all students. Some sort of language there that draws back to that students at the center and student focus.
Why?
And have to reduce isolation and
reduce program inequities.
And program inequities is what the language is on page 2. So to repeat that.
So maybe I lack imagination, but I'm trying to think about how you do that without people coming to the conclusion that you're either going to get rid of programs or you're going to move away from neighborhood schools, because we have only a set number of buildings.
I think in the Q&A it talks about our co-location's always been, it says some are going to continue because we're not enough buildings in the system to replace the facilities director program.
I think at the last meeting we talked about, we do have some Spanish immersion schools that maybe could be in close proximity. They could perhaps become a Spanish immersion school, and then the neighborhood schools would become one neighborhood school. And that's one of the conversations we'll be having.
And if you look at the bullet point above that, support equitable programming, it mentions possibly maintaining regional K-8 school options to support program pathway continuity, for example, through language immersion pathways.
Or could be
I guess I look at like Ruther and Scott, and we have now one school that's that's not co-located, but we left the other school was still a co-located program. And I'm just trying to think of like how we do that and like what sort of expectations we're setting.
so when you can do it and there's a reason to do it and it makes sense to do it, then it would be something we bring forward. But it's not where we're trying. It would not be possible to undo all co-locations.
So I'm not suggesting it. I guess I'm also wanting to be careful because of this huge swath in Southeast that has so many co-located programs. If the solution is, then some of those become all special programs, and then they're not neighborhood, is that you lose that neighborhood piece. And it's just almost every other part of the city you have lots of neighborhood schools, and I think it's a good value, but I think we're like pregnant already, and I don't see how we elevate that without actually having a huge ripple effect in terms of our commitment, unless we don't want to have that.
Well, I think that's part of the consideration of whether or not you do it, or what proximity is that.
You do the analysis and see what you can do.
And this isn't just CLI, but it's also like talking about access or Pioneer
IB.
or IB and
Primary.
Fully locate those.
Well, IB's not fully paid, is it?
Yeah, like Vernon. Well, no, it's a whole school
It's
program.
a whole school.
Yeah, but I mean as a K-8. Keep it as a K-8.
Yeah, just.
In general, I think I understand the reason for the sort of looking more staging. And sort of explained that, in terms of there's a lot of work going on in beach. I guess the only question is, how do you, it does feel like the downside of that would be that as you do one area and one area, by the time you get to the third, you have limited your options for that third area without sort of a comprehensive way. So if you did the entire district, which I'm not advocating for, you would have more options. Is there a way that you can sort of minimize that?
So there's a river that runs.
There's
a river that runs through
Yeah.
Portland.
I thought you said river.
There's a lot of rivers too, yeah.
And so the southwest area, we currently have very few students crossing that river. So really having that being the third phase, it'd be very unusual for us to create boundaries across the river. Right now we have none other than some special education programs and some district-wide.
So even with 9 bridges, we don't cross on boundaries? I'm being a little facetious, but maybe I'm not. Like, is that a general?
The river is
We don't now.
It's
I'm
a
just-
geographical.
Yeah, but I'm curious, is that, have we ever reassessed that issue?
So
Or we just cross the
our
river.
west, south.
So let me ask the question differently. Let me ask the question
Once or
differently. Would some of our boundary issues get easier to deal with if we were willing to extend school boundaries, for instance?
Like South One, Cleveland.
I don't think so, because our high schools are well balanced on the west-southwest. And right now we have, the west-southwest has been done recently and a lot of work was completed. So there's really only 1 or 2 places to even to consider. So there's not a lot of work to do there. So I think keeping that separate unless it's not going to be.
And so, okay, so you think that minimizes by staging it with the river?
And
sort
we're
of
being very
minimizes
careful
that.
about how we're going
Yeah.
from south to north.
Yeah.
For time out real quick and putting your kids on the other side of the river from your house, I think that would be a big conversation.
I think a lot of people work on the other side of the river.
18 years.
Yeah.
2 earthquakes.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a
The
concern.
practical question becomes, how much time do you want your kids sitting on a school bus stuck in traffic trying to cross a bridge? That's one consideration. So I'm not saying we should just say, don't look at that, but
Okay.
I never crossed the river.
it's a reality. There's all sorts of it. We looked at a little bit of that.
Okay, we don't need to debate the river. I'm
I'm
sorry.
We digress.
So thank you, that answers my
Rita.
question.
I mean, here's the thing, is if we go through this process and if economics balancing isn't at all a factor, then you do keep the river as a boundary.
A natural boundary.
Because.
So much anymore, that's not really true, actually.
Well, if you look at the income.
Which we have.
The North
Highest
Portland,
SES neighborhood is Irvington,
Irvington, and the entire west side. So I'm
not
just.
outer Southwest.
Oh, yeah, that's,
Yeah.
oh, well, okay.
I can
Let's-
show-
Let's have
I
that
can- yeah.
offline, because
But I'm
that
just-
has changed tremendously.
I'm just saying,
that's not
we,
the case
Yeah,
anymore.
that's the way it was when I went to
Yeah.
school here.
well, if you
It's
have,
a lot.
okay, I'll show the.
What were you trying to
I
say?
just got it.
So the other answer that I would offer to your question about the phasing is, we're talking about having a master plan. So you kind of work out the analysis ahead of time, but you implement in phases.
But we're not
So you work
talking,
out, you work.
Is that,
but we're not talking about that here, because we're not
Yeah.
talking about beyond northeast.
So right now,
Yes, we are.
we're.
This is a 3-year plan. This is the whole enchilada here.
But I think we're
Oh,
gonna
is
be
that
learning.
Okay, that's a good, I didn't realize that.
I
I'm
didn't
not
know
opposed to it, I just didn't realize it.
So
Does have a 3-year
the operational question is, I mean, there's a couple of things. We have to figure out
That's not clear.
what's going to happen in different school buildings.
It's
That's
in
the
the-
reconfiguration, feeder pattern,
Right here.
co-location. And then there's the boundaries. And if you have a community conversation here to get us recommendations on how to deal with southeast and then do north-northeast, it's when do we have to draw the boundaries on the east side becomes the, and then if we draw the boundaries at the same time on the east side, then we don't get into that conundrum of, oh shoot, we already made this decision, and now how are we going to, when we're in a box, which I think is what you were.
It is, but honestly, I've lost. This is my problem with conversations as we get towards 10 o'clock at night. So I'm actually now confused. What I think I heard you say was that we're going to do a 3-year master plan and then implement it district or zone by zone. What I thought I read in this is that we're going to attack each zone individually and address the issues within it.
Okay, so this was a, there was a lot of editing that happened. So if you look under approach and sequence, right? Number 1 is data-informed district-wide plan. Okay. Number 2 is phased implementation using regional approach focus. And the first line of that is, while the master plan will use a district-wide perspective, its implementation will occur in phases over the next several years.
Okay, yes, are you agreeing with that? It seemed like
So
maybe you weren't.
we are looking at data now, and by starting with the southeast area, and we go a little bit into the north so that we have a good, we believe we have the schools that we'll need, and then we continue into the north in the next, so knowing where things overlap and where there's crowding on that boundary between south and north, we've been very purposeful as we're organizing each region. But tonight we're not really getting into the regions, but we are looking at a district-wide set of data so that we make sure that we're grouping our schools appropriately into the 3 phases of work.
Andrew, I think what's confusing is that it was a really significant rewrite, and that's a lot of the new material. And again, not that there's anything wrong with it, but I think that is, there's a lot of, like the concept of the master plan and talking
But
about
the rewrite, I guess I'm actually less interested in the rewrite is what I'm reading and what I'm hearing. And I don't mean this to create tension where there might not be any. But what Rita said is not what Claire said, and it's not what you said. So I do think it's important that we make sure that we're talking about the same thing.
And before you do, let me add my question, which hasn't been specifically addressed, which is that, southeast implicated in the Kellogg stuff, north after that, this directly calls out southwest, west after that. But to me, that still leaves southeast that is not directly implicated in the Kellogg stuff.
Actually, we go pretty wide in southeast.
You mean to the river?
Just about. There's a little bit.
So
There's a little bit on the bottom that's left out.
Taking in everything, basically.
The westernmost part of the southeast section
So like including Selwood and
any adjustment. So I'm trying not to call out any specific schools tonight.
No, but I'm just,
So
but
I'm
the
really
reason I'm
trying not to
adding
do
the
that.
question to your question is, are you proposing actually that this is a master plan that takes into account every
3
neighborhood
separate
and every
areas.
school? Okay.
And this is so what I'm
It
understanding.
does not mean that every school will be
No.
involved in the process.
Can I ask my question?
Yeah.
And I really mean it generically, I don't mean it specifically. It seems to me that if I were doing this with a computer, there are 2 different ways I could do it. I could look at all the data for the entire district. I could figure out where the overcrowding and undercrowding was. I could figure out equitable programs or not. I could begin to adjust boundaries and lines in terms of where I think things are going to go. And then I could say, instead of implementing it all at once, I'm going to go to southeast and do a community engagement process, et cetera, and implement there, and then I'm going to go to north, northeast, and then I'm going to go west side. But I would have started with a master plan that pretty much defined where I wanted to go.
So I want to clarify one thing.
I was going to give you option B.
Well,
so you can tell me which one it is.
Okay.
Option
but
B.
There's a problem with option A that is a big problem, and because it involves no community engagement before you're drawing lines. So I wouldn't want to ever put that proposal.
So you're not doing option A?
No.
Go to
We
option
have
B.
community
Okay,
engagement.
but I'm pretty sure I heard, again, I'm not, it's 10 o'clock at night, we should have ended this meeting an hour ago, but I think I heard Rita say that she thought we were doing option A with sort of the master plan. What I thought I heard you say, and what I read in here is, we're gonna go to that area, create a plan for that area. We're gonna take into account the boundary, because we're gonna be moving, that's smarter. But we're not gonna be doing a master plan for the entire district. We're gonna be doing it in phases. We'll end up with a comprehensive.
And what I'm understanding the master plan is the sort of scope of work, the values, kind of way we're gonna look at things. Is that, I mean, that's what I'm understanding as the master plan is that sort of
We're
bedrock
also
that we're then
looking
gonna
at
look
where, how we're separating the south from the north. We're looking very closely at that.
And that makes sense to me. And again,
Yeah.
I think there are a couple of potential downsides, because by the time you get to the end, you might have limited things. But if we're keeping those in mind throughout, I think the upsides outweigh them. I think it makes sense.
So if we're gonna continue with a continual process, we're doing this over 3 years, southeast, north, west, then do we go back to southeast? I mean, is it every 3 years?
No.
What's the long-term plan of like continuing to have a vibrant ability to be agile and?
I would
look
hope
at
that we
this?
are not always in enrollment. I think that.
You said new board members.
How many circles of enrollment?
I would not want to predict how long it would last, because we have gentrification happening in different neighborhoods and numbers change. However, we constantly monitor it, right, so that we know when we're getting some imbalance. And then it needs to get enough of an imbalance for it to come back forward.
Are other districts like Beaverton do rebalancing, redistricting far more often than we do?
No.
But
Well,
you
okay,
are
so
looking at a
let me
mechanism.
just clarify, so PPS never does it?
We spend a lot of time.
Hey, we did it successfully 4 years ago. On the west side.
So how do the high schools fit in the master plan? Benson is a district-wide, and, but it has impacts on schools in all the quadrants, and same thing with most of the high schools. I mean, let's just say Wilson and Lincoln are, if you're gonna cross the river, they're taken care of. I mean, they're not subject to it, but everything else is sort of not a geographic, like, we're going to, northeast. Well, then you have a whole bunch of schools potentially, but also that split into southeast, and how do they fit in the master plan?
So right now, because of the middle schools opening in the southeast, that's creating new feeder patterns that will also need to be aligned to high schools. So that's how we'll be talking about the, especially the overcrowding at Franklin and the under-enrollment in Madison. There's also, we have some programs that have some long-term associations to a specific high school that program may not even be in that region or in that physically located where they've been assigned to a high school that's also adding to the overcrowding. So we're looking at those programs as well to see where does it make sense for everything to align. So we will be looking at high schools, especially with those middle school programs, but then when we get up to the northeast, that's when we need to look at Grant, where it's overcrowded, for instance. And we also need to look at what's happening with Jefferson.
Like, Madison opens, what, in 2022?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that's like, it's not just a Franklin, but it's also a Grant. So it seems like if it's a 3-year plan that.
So
that would.
What I'm saying is really we're looking at it in the first 2 years.
May not solve the whole problem
May
with that
not, right,
first
but-
implementation.
Right, but we're starting to look at those pieces. When we're in the southeast, we'll look at it when we're looking at middle school feeder patterns, and that will help adjust. We're also looking at programs that are going across the district in various ways that are impacting 2 crowded high schools that we might be able to help balance out Cleveland, for instance, or and Grant. And then we need to address the Jefferson high school boundary, but that's something that I'm not really ready to talk about specifically how we're going to do that tonight, because that's something that I would want to involve a whole lot of group of people before we went forward with that.
I guess I look at, if this is a 3-year plan, I would want to have the high schools called out, not just removing from geographic areas.
I've got that in the outcome goals. You've asked me to add the high schools there, and you've asked me also to do it under the why we are doing this, and you've listed several reasons here.
I look forward to seeing which they take.
Other
Okay,
considerations?
so I think I need some clarity, because I think,
In terms of our policy?
well, I think what Andrew said is accurate. I think you're hearing two different interpretations of what we're doing. So I need some clarity. What are we doing?
You mean implementation versus master plan?
Are we doing a master plan or not? Because when I hear you talk, it does not sound like we're doing a master plan. It sounds like we're going to be looking at hotspots. And we're going to be looking at, these few neighborhoods, and we're going to fix that, and then we're going to move on to another one. And
So it's very difficult.
been there, done that.
It's very difficult for me to go through all the things that we're considering right now without listing out a whole series of schools that we've been identifying, describing, and processing about where they're fitting. But the Southeast has about 20 schools in
Okay.
that process. So that's not a small group of schools.
I have
Yeah.
okay, just to be really clear,
Yeah.
I have no problem with the concept of phased implementation. No problem at all.
But you're
What I want to know is what we're implementing. What is it that we're phasing? Are we phasing the analysis, or are we phasing the implementation?
Right.
So those are two very different things. in my
I
mind.
think the analysis is starting at the beginning. That's why we're talking about the data informed in the first step. So we are looking at data now. We're not going, we're not far enough along with that in order to bring you specifics about each region. But the regions will come forward once we've completed looking at that data. I think Scott attended one of our meetings today where we were talking about how we will phase the Southeast over. The two middle schools will be, Kellogg will be for 2021, and the other school will be probably a year later because we'll have to go into the north to complete the attendance boundary for that one. So that one is a phasing in, but it's all part of a master plan for the Southeast at the beginning.
But okay, so what I want, this is what I thought we were getting. This is what I thought we were buying. A data-informed district-wide plan, which in my head means, yeah, we know we have to do Southeast, and we know there are going to be several pieces, several components of doing Southeast. Okay, but because the district, especially the east side, is a closed ecosystem, when you screw around with one area, you gotta mess with another area. I would like us to know how it's gonna mess with other areas before we come up with a plan for a region.
And that's exactly what we were talking about in our meeting today, is that very thing about how are we staging the middle schools in the Southeast, and how one needs to be staged with starting in the Southeast in the first year and finishing with the Northeast changes in the second year. So we're talking about those very things.
Okay, so at what point, so we're gonna start with Southeast, at what point are you gonna start thinking about what you have to do in Northeast? Is it gonna be before you start actually implementing stuff in Southeast, or after?
So what I can say is that we're not gonna talk about any boundary changes until we have a community process formed. We'll certainly identify areas where we have imbalances, but we're not going to be looking for solutions until we bring in our school principals and our community members to drive the process.
At what point are you going to do that? Are you going to do it at the front end, or are you going to do it at the back end?
You mean on the whole thing as a...
Okay, are we doing district-wide planning, or are we not?
Yes, we
That's my
are,
question.
but I think what I see differently than you do is the actual drawing of the lines will not happen ahead of time. We're certainly talking about, we have this region here with these concerns, we have this region here with these concerns. What crosses over between those two regions, and we're identifying those.
So I
that
think
we have that master plan.
By saying, I think maybe still your essential question has not been answered, which is the implementation in service to a district-wide sense of what needs to be done, a district-wide sense of comprehensive analysis, or is the analysis being limited at the front end to the first phase of implementation, and then the analysis will follow for the follow-on pieces? And I think what you just said is that there is a comprehensive underlying analysis, but that we won't be going to solutions for anything other than those in the first phase of the work. But that there is a recognition that you have to do the comprehensive analysis of the whole system before you tackle how you're going to implement in that first phase.
And I heard you say that when you talked about like where's that north-south line and sort of, so I'm feeling like I get it, and I'm not sure why there's a disconnect, but I also think there's great wisdom in this. We're going to rest in some district values and an overarching understanding of where we're going, but we're not going to get into the weeds of drawing the lines except by, like very intentional community engagement in each region. And so it's this sort of overarching way of looking at it. And we know there will be some like southeast and northeast butting up against each other, but we have some clarity around that. And so the wisdom of like really trying to do some local things. And one of the things I love about this scope of work is that call to be a learning community, that we're going to do this in southeast. And I know we've talked about we don't want to balance on the back of southeast and experiment there, but that's where like the biggest need is. And then we'll learn for when we go to northeast, we'll learn for when we go to southwest, and then we can, we'll come back where there's issues and learn again. I mean, I think that's the part of the cycle.
But here's the question I think that Director Moore is trying to get clarified is, are we going to do a southeast process that determines the feeder patterns, that looks at some high school, make sure the high schools at least move towards balancing, looks at any kind of co-locations, and I don't know if it's hopefully before that have figured out access. Once that process is done, hopefully by June, I think is our timeline.
No, it's actually in
November.
It's in
November. Okay, when that process is done, does that include drawing boundaries?
So I think what I'm hearing you say, the question is when will the boundaries be drawn? If we're starting this process now, and we're supposed to commence in spring 20, when will we have the new boundaries for southeast?
So the southeast area would be coming forward to the board in November.
Of 20.
Of 20, as a draft. But certainly the community group will create many drafts along the way until we get, there'll be multiple versions of it starting in the spring, going all the way to October, and then bringing something to the board in November.
And those would be then started in fall of 21.
Mm-hmm.
And so then for the north, you would start the process of community engagement in
We're actually
spring
going
of
to start
21.
in the, I'm going to say about November, December, as that one's finishing. We'll start gathering a new community group together so that in January we can get going.
And then that would be before the board in November of 21, or 20?
Yeah, well, we want to make sure we're done by January of 21.
And then
or 22.
The west would be November of 22.
So here's the deal. If you draw boundaries in southeast and a little bit of north, apart from the rest of the district, then we do not have a master plan. And I am pushing for a master plan.
I think we need to understand what your definition of a master plan is, because I had a, obviously I have a different understanding of what you're saying a master plan
I think I've been very clear with you. I think I've been very clear with everybody.
Well, you haven't been clear with me. So
okay,
clarify.
the master plans, we figure out what's going to happen in the school buildings, and then we do the metrics.
You're saying district-wide too? Okay.
Or
So-
I'd settle
so
for
the-
east side-wide, okay?
But
Well,
I guess the
okay,
the
so
question
that's
is
actually-
maybe a nuance of like how you do it, like you're saying draw the boundaries. That means if there's multiple boundaries, that means we're having like community engagement processes all over the place.
And do you want the district, like Claire's team, to draw boundaries and then take those out for community engagement? Is that the master plan you want to see? Because I'm not sure how you're going to.
What I see in this is as much a logistics issue as anything else, that doing that is going to take a very long time, the community engagement district-wide, and as a result, I actually think we can't do it for you, right? So the question is, do we, I mean, it seems like the approach you're advocating, we actually need to wait until, frankly, staff have more capacity, because that it's a big bang implementation, right? So a big bang implementation, and I said at the very beginning, has some advantages. I can see those advantages, but it's also really hard to pull off.
But the hybrid is, I think what you're saying is that the proposal for the first chunk of the actual proposed boundary changes that will go to the community, that will not be set in stone, will be informed by district-wide or east side-wide analysis. So there will not be analysis done just for that area of that set of buildings. It's just that there are not going to be proposals coming forward for boundary changes for the rest of those schools that are not implicated by what we're trying to do for Kellogg.
Well, here's the deal. If you draw boundaries in southeast, and then you go do north-northeast, not to mention what's happening in the part of southeast that won't be part of that community conversation. And then you go, okay, now we need to do boundaries there too. You're gonna come back to that initial southeast and say, oh, you know, last year we told you your kid's going here, well this year we're telling you your kid's going here. That's gonna happen unless you do the boundaries all at once.
But what I'm hearing Claire say is that we are doing the boundaries of, and we may not, I'm just gonna say school name, this is not coming from you. Let's say we don't do Selwood's boundaries because there's not a need there right now, that is balanced, there's enough resources, and so it's not a place we need to have the conversation, but we do need to have the conversation where Kellogg is opening and where we need a second middle school. And so that if something is stable and working, we don't necessarily need to mess with it. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. And so we're looking at the places and those boundaries where we need to make a change or where there's overcrowding, and that we don't want to just capriciously move students from schools, and that this is a very data-driven initial look at the whole district and where do we need to be strategic about implementing this rather than the Big Bang implementation, which I think our experience, I mean, I wasn't on SBAC, but I think the experience of doing that Big Bang implementation has been a lot of community turmoil, and I think if we have a phased approach based on our values around being really strategic about where are there issues and how do we redraw those boundaries, that will be a stronger way to do this than the wholesale upheaval of the whole district.
Amy, are we doing public comment in this section of the meeting?
We will be, yeah.
Because we have some people who I think have strong opinions in the audience. I would love to hear from them.
And would you do public comment now and come back to this conversation? Would you really need to
I
wrap up?
think there's a disconnect here. I mean, it's late. Trust me, it's late. I think there is a disconnect between the approach and some of the board, and I would just love to hear from the community if anybody wants to talk about it.
All right, come forward.
I will speak.
3 minutes. Haley's got her time.
I don't have anything written, so you'll have to tell me when to stop talking. So my name is Gabriel Mercedes Bolivar, and I am a Jefferson High School Octave Green and Chief Joseph parent. And I survived the Jefferson Cluster Enrollment Balancing, which was done in a silo. What Scott and Rita are talking about is the way this is being presented is that same silo. There's a domino here. That didn't work. It created so much turmoil and so much displacement of students. And let's not forget that the year prior to that is when we had closed Humboldt, and immediately on day one, Boise Elliott Humboldt was over enrolled, and there was not enough space for the students. We continue to do this cycle of one-off. And what happens is you lose the political will and the political capital that you've had from us. We weren't listened to. There were absolutely community engagement meetings. But what happened is we were essentially pawns in the system because I asked repeatedly, and you can go back and look at all the tapes because I was there at every single meeting. I joined SACIT as a result of that, the Superintendent Advisory Committee on Enrollment and Transfer. And I said there is a consequence when you look at what you call a hot spot, and it's a domino. So if you've ever played that game, you do something over here, it's going to come over here. So if you say, I can only look at this one middle school, and so we're going to only identify the boundaries for this school, you are ignoring everything else and you're creating a new crisis that you don't even know you have till that first day of school. And then, so what we have asked for, and the community has asked for decades now, is a district-wide comprehensive analysis
and boundary balancing. And that is why many of us are showing up again, because that was our expectation, is that this would truly be district-wide. It's not about being capricious and trying to just randomly move people. It's about being thoughtful, intentional, data-driven, looking at our enrollment trends. If you go from south to north, you're gonna end up where you have nowhere left to put kids. And that's what we see happen over and over. So it's like deja vu, sitting here and listening to the same conversations that we've been coming to over and over and over and expecting a different outcome. That different outcome never happens.
I'm going to talk. It sounds like what you were referring to before was much smaller and district-wide. Is there any middle ground in your mind? Because going through the SBAC process, myself and with my kids, there were issues around DBRAC.
You're talking DBRAC, not SBAC. And I was
when they changed the boundaries, and the schools, there were some issues, but in the end, it did end up working out, and that was a little bit of a bigger boundary issue.
It worked out for whom? I mean,
well, it worked out for
it didn't work out for everybody.
It worked out for the neighborhood for Hayhurst, which was sharing a location with Odyssey, and both of those schools I think are better off, as a result.
Worked out for the high schools.
I guess my question to you is a little bit more academic. Is there a middle ground there between sort of, because I think only doing 2 or 3 schools, I see a huge problem. What I'm hearing the district say is we're doing 20 schools in this region.
It's still going to be a pendulum, because if you say that the hard line is here and then you run out of space, what do you do when you get over here, or vice versa? So if once you draw that hard line, you're going to have to go back to some community, or you're going to have to suffer the consequences in this community. And that's what happens over and over. And during that DBRAC process is where many of us fought and won to get Ockley Green, but again, it wasn't without turmoil. I mean, we had to go with a merge and then an uncoupling and then bringing new schools in, and it's created a lot of bad will within the community, and that's why you don't see people showing up anymore, because people literally believe our voices don't matter, what we've asked for doesn't matter, and ultimately, this is where we get.
Doing it district-wide means waiting 2 to 3 years. Is that worth the time?
To me, it is worth the time if it's done district-wide. It's intentional. So you're front-loading the whole process district-wide, and then you're doing a phased implementation approach. That makes absolute sense. And you're using that phased implementation approach to inform the process. But we're not informing that process when we're doing it in a silo. And while we're doing this, we're not even thinking about, well, my perception is we're not thinking about the impact of special education and where the programs are. So as a parent who's had a child in special education, that's another thing that we have to think about. All of this gets impacted because we're constantly shuffling. It's like a one-off. Oh no, we'll put the special education program over here. Now we'll put it over here. Okay. And so if you don't think about it district-wide, you lose this opportunity to keep the community together.
I've taken you over your 3 minutes, so I'm sorry.
But also very valuable, and I want to just get through whoever else would like to come forward and give 3 minutes of public testimony so that we can get back to our conversation and wrap it up.
I don't have
Thanks.
anything prepared. I'm Heidi Owen. I'm a parent of a student at Cleveland High School. She just finished up middle school at the Access program. So she was part of Access getting split up. And what I saw in that process was dealing with a certain area and certain schools. And what happened was that an alternative program for gifted students and a special ed program, Pioneer, and very low-income schools were all horribly, horribly hurt and impacted by that siloing. And what we were told, and what I expected, maybe I wasn't told this, but what I expected when PPS was going to do their boundary review was that they were going to look at the entire district and figure out, I don't see anything on those materials, maybe I missed it, about focus option review. I don't see anything. I see things about limiting co-locations. How can you limit co-locations if you aren't looking district-wide? How are we not going to do this enrollment balancing process without being on the backs of all the special programs that were talked about less than an hour ago? And Access is one of them, and special ed is another. And what happens when you do southeast? It says access is going to be part of the southeast boundary review. Why? Access was northeast. Now it got moved to southeast. It's not part of southeast. Access should be a central program. And special ed should be considered. And when you silo the boundary review process, and you're not looking at focus options, and you're not looking at the language immersion options, and you're not actually assessing the district and what are the district's educational needs and where should those programs be. So we're talking about special schools, and yes, you can fix these. What I'm hearing is hotspot work, and when you fix hotspots, the people who lose are the special ed kids and the alternative kids and the alliance kids. Those are the kids that lose. And it's happening again. Please don't do that.
Do you have any other public testimony? Come on. You were the only one who was under your 3 minutes. Good job.
I'm Matt Marjanovic. I've been coming to these meetings for a while. In addition to everything that has just been said, I just want to say that for all the talk of being a data-driven process, I haven't really seen any data yet, which is a little bit disturbing because this whole discussion hasn't been informed by any data yet. And for the people who are new to the board and haven't seen this before, you have a lot of ideas of how things should work that make sense, but they don't actually make sense if you look at the actual data and the dynamics of how enrollment works and the dynamics of moving boundaries around and putting kids in the classrooms. Flow Analytics was hired a year ago. I was expecting to see the contract called for a comprehensive report on program and system-wide analysis that was supposed to come out 6 months ago and then pushed off to September. And I don't know if that report is still in the works or if that's just been dropped on the floor. But I would expected that something like that would be informing this kind of process. If anything, there's like historical data you can look at to look at what the volatility is in demographics from year to year, especially at grade level demographics, because even if you have a class, a school that has the right size, you'll notice that, if you look at grades, you'll see that like the number of kids in grades fluctuates from grade to grade violently in schools in different places year to year. And so there's schools that are, have grades that are under-enrolled and they have classrooms with 40 kids in them, and the same school can have classrooms with 20, 25 kids in them. But they show up as being perfectly balanced on the books if that's all you're looking at. And these are all things that if you were at least even looking at historical data would help inform this discussion what you guys need to do.
Thank you. And we did receive some of that data in our last work session. Is there anybody else who wants to? Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Mary Pat Hensel, and I'm representing some young families in Southwest Portland. If this process goes forward, we would be kind of the last of the Mohicans in Southwest. And one of the things I just want to make sure that Portland Public Schools really takes into consideration is if things that are going on that have to do with residential infill in Southwest Corridor and some of the other plans aren't integrated into how the schools are built, there are going to be some serious problems, and Southwest is going to take the hit on some of those issues that haven't happened up until now, but could well happen if we aren't thinking in advance of what the needs might be. We talk about the river being a boundary. We have highways and areas that are boundaries, and you have kids crossing over those right now in Southwest. So I really want everybody to realize that even though you think of Southwest as an area that has a lot of upper class people, you also have a lot of immigrants. We have a big immigrant population at Markham Elementary, and we really need to make sure that we take care of the students that aren't the way that we have thought about Southwest Portland being in the past.
Thank you. I think it's back to you, Claire.
Well, I have taken language forward, but I do think that Rita and Scott and I need to sit down and have further conversations so that we're making sure we understand what each other's words mean, because clearly we had a disconnect here. And so I think that's probably the next step before we can bring it back to the board.
I do think that also though with that generally we've had board agreement that like the first phase of this work is the configuration of Kellogg. And it's a question of to what extent does that flow from analysis of just that southeast initially, or to do that piece of work, which we've identified as our first piece of work, is do we need to have clear and comprehensive analysis of the whole underlying system?
But I think at this point, I take the comments that I received tonight, and that we will need to schedule quickly, because this is supposed to come back to the next board meeting, right? And we'll want to get something back out to you in the packet, so we probably have to do some electronic communication about our next draft coming forward. And then I was hoping to make it an easy conversation at the 25th, because it is a large meeting, a long meeting, but we may not be able to do that.
Thank you very much.
So getting the red line was really helpful.
So appreciate the discussion. I think everyone certainly seeing the tension with some of the immediate steps that we know we must take with wanting to have that comprehensive analysis and a long-range plan that we make a reality over time. Because we want to be thoughtful about it, and this has been many years of attempts. And we're thankful that folks have been sharing some of that history along the way. And the challenge for us is going to be doing that analysis thoughtfully, the bandwidth that we have. And so that's going to require some supports if we want to keep to a timeline that can provide some recommendations for us to move forward. So I know that staff's been listening carefully to the discussion tonight.
Is there an update on the work with full analytics?
Yes, we have we have a whole database of data that we're preparing, and we were going to deliver with our planning committee process, and to give a whole binder of data to the board as well. But
that was the plan for the 25th?
No, it was not planned for the 25th. Really not seeing the need for a lot of data to talk about the scope of work. We're really getting the data going forward as we're getting into it, was our hope.
Thank you.
Scott and Rita, do you want to let us at least schedule something tonight?